everyone. Welcome to the second event of the summer series hosted by the California Landscape Stewardship Network. Last week, we had the pleasure of bringing naturalist John Muir Laws on to invigorate our curiosity about nature through a blend of art and science. And today, we're thrilled to present a workshop on collaborative leadership. This workshop is part of a broader initiative that the California Network is sponsoring, aimed at building out a collaborative skills curriculum to be delivered to practitioners like yourselves. It builds upon the strengths of our colleagues working in our state universities here in California, our partners in Montana and Michigan, and our international partners in landscape stewardship. My name is Devin Landry. I serve in a coordinating role for the California Landscape Stewardship Network, and I'm excited to join you today as part of the network and to deliver this workshop as an example of one of its key focal areas in building partnership capacity. Much like we talked about last week, a lot of us come here from different backgrounds and experiences, but our commonality is that we are serving and working to protect places that we care about and places that we love. And with that commonality expressed, I want to show you an image of a place that I came to love as a child that really has helped me embark on a career in conservation. This is Crane Beach in the North Shore of Massachusetts. This was my grandfather's favorite place and a place that he worked much of his adult life to steward and conserve for his community. Mm-hmm. And the values of conservation and stewardship that he instilled in me today are much the reason why I have the pleasure of talking to you all about collaborative leadership and its role in 21st century conservation. So it's great to see you all join us today. And with that, I want to hand it over to my colleague, Dylan Skybrook. Dylan, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dylan Skybrook. I'm glad to see you all. I manage the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network, which is a regional network of land management organizations here in California, covering the Santa Cruz Mountains. I'm also on the steering committee of the California Landscape Stewardship Network. I'm happy to be here presenting today. My strongest interest around collaboration is the relationship between how we see the world, whether it's interconnected or not, and how that informs how we act, especially in collaboration. And that's really, for me, the foundation of collaboration. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about just a little bit later. But for now, just hello, glad you're here, and I'm going to turn it over to Sean Johnson.
All right. Well, thank you both for kicking us off. Devin, Dylan, it's always a great pleasure to be working with you both. Let me add my welcome to today's workshop and my thanks to all of you for joining us. It's great to see so many of your familiar faces, and for those of you that have your video off, your familiar names. I even see a former student, Dav, on here. So hey, Dav, thanks for jumping in and joining us here. That's really cool to see. I searched high and low for a shirt that wasn't plaid, and I hope you're not disappointed in that, but I have a reputation of facilitating all the California Landscape Stewardship Network meetings in a plaid shirt, and I thought I'd just throw a wrench in the typical script and try a plain colored shirt today. I hope everyone's adjusting to that new reality and not too thrown off. But anyway, my name is Sean Johnson. I'm the managing director of a small applied research center at the University of Montana called the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy. And through that position and over the course of, 12, 15 years now, I've had the pleasure of being a part of so many conversations about place and about collaboration and about how we can work together to really care for the places and the communities that we love. I've been part of early conversations that created the Practitioners Network for Landscape Conservation, which is now the Network for Landscape Conservation. Been a founding member and leadership team of the Roundtable on the Crown of the Continent. Been involved with the California Landscape Stewardship Network, and more recently helped initiate a conversation and form the Western Collaborative Conservation Network. And in all of those efforts, I've seen a real need to spend more time reflecting on and advancing the core skills and abilities that support the kind of partnership and network-based work that we do together. Before we launch today, I just want to say a quick word about our intention in bringing this conversation to you. Our intention is simply to provide a forum and a place for us to come together as colleagues to build and share knowledge through meaningful conversation about what collaborative leadership skills are, ways to improve that skill set over time. We all have a little bit of insight and experience, but I wouldn't say any of us alone are experts. It's really our collective effort that's bringing this conversation forward, and that includes all of you that have joined us today. We're very interested in this conversation and convinced that it can make a real difference as we move forward in our work. So to that end, we've framed some ideas that we think are an important start to this conversation. They're fairly high level, more around building awareness of the systems and structures in which we work today. And we'll be asking for your ideas and insights along the way. As this conversation unfolds in the coming months, we're certain that we'll all find a way to work together in a way that's better informed and a way that allows us all to ask better questions about the work that we're trying to do. So with that, and recognizing the limitations that I have, I want to just start by connecting with all of you and ask you to follow the link that I believe Devin is going to throw into the chat box here to a quick poll everywhere exercise. I'm going to share my screen that'll give you the link there as well. But the idea here is to start by asking you to reflect on the work that you're doing. What is it that you're doing in partnership with others? Why is it that you are attracted to today's conversation? What are the skills that you rely on or that you rely on in others to successfully lead, communicate, engage, and amplify the work that you're doing? So think about that and think about the skill set in particular, and I'm gonna grab my screen here. Hopefully I'm sharing the right screen. So if you can't see the link, let me know. It's my desktop view. Okay, let me try again. Looks like you guys are coming up there. There we go. So thinking about the collaborative skills needed to work together at the landscape scale, you guys are on it with the technology. Nice job. So you're throwing up words like trust and patience and good faith and listening, honesty, values, empathy, authenticity, compromise, intelligence, openness, humility, collaboration and collaborative skills. Honesty again. They're bouncing around so quickly, it's a little bit hard for me to keep up. This is fantastic. Let's let it go for another minute or two here. The words that are larger on the screen are those that are being shared multiple times. So really coming through loud and clear are listening, trust, patience, humility, openness, communication. So just reflecting on that for a second, for me, I think it's really hard not to think about this work from our own perspective, that we're really thinking about those interpersonal skills, those connections, those relationships that we have that are foundational to all the work. And what I'd like to do today is capture this conversation, and I'm actually going to do a screen capture of that word cloud and share it again later today. But let's hold that thought in our mind and let's step back from those interpersonal connections now to think more about the set of conditions within which our work exists. What are the systems in which we operate? How can we think more completely about not just the interpersonal, but the systems and the process dynamics that really affect this work? I think it's the combination of all of those that really bring the work to life and help us identify the skills that are needed to be effective. So thanks so much for jumping in with that conversation. the last thing I want to share before handing it off to Dylan here is just a word about collaborative leadership and how it's a little bit different maybe than the other kinds of leadership that we're familiar with. And there are a whole bunch of different quotes, a whole bunch of different experts in this, but I want to just read a quick line from David Crislip and Carl Larson's book on collaborative leadership, because it's more about speaking to what the process of collaborative leadership looks like, rather than trying to nail it down to any specific skill set or definition. And it's all about bringing together the appropriate people in constructive ways with good information to create authentic visions and strategies for addressing shared concerns. So in another way, and I often think about the work that I do, it's often just about trying to bring together the right people with the right information and the right process to achieve a shared purpose. So hold that thought in your mind as we jump into a discussion on collaborative leadership skills. And Dylan, you want to take it away from here?
All right. Thanks, Sean. So man, looking at that word cloud, I'm feeling like we got nothing to really share with everyone in this group. You all already know what's going on already, so that's good. One of the things when you start to talk about collaboration, there's a bunch of different things that people talk about. And so we are presenting a model today of collaboration that has 4 different categories that are not perfect, but they help us think comprehensively about the issue so that we can cover a bunch of different things. So those categories are worldview. In other words, how we understand the world to work, specifically if we understand that it's interconnected or not, and how that might affect how we act in collaboration. The second category is network, which is essentially about the social impact networks that are a structure for collaboration that many of us participate in. The third category is what we're calling essential skills, which are those interpersonal skills that are really necessary to collaborate well with our partners. And then the fourth category is what we're calling project skills, which are things like writing MOUs or contracts or whatever that help organizations work together. And we're really not going to talk about that fourth category because we feel like most of y'all already have that down. Your organizations already have that capacity. We're really just going to talk about these first 3. But what's interesting is that the through line through all 4 of those categories is relationship. You know, even when we're talking about MOUs and so on, it's always about relationship, about connecting up, and so on. And so that's the through line. One other note about this particular workshop today, it's really about building awareness. We would need more time to really do skill building and so on. I mean, there's some skill building that comes from building awareness. But nonetheless, today really is about building awareness. And as Devin mentioned earlier, this group that's been working on collaborative leadership is, that's a part of the California Landscape Stewardship Network, is definitely planning on developing a larger curriculum around collaborative leadership. So you can really see today as introductory in that way, and look for more from the folks who are presenting today sometime in the future. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen so I can stop looking at my own face. All right, did that work? Are you all seeing the slideshow?
Hi, Jim.
Did you say yes?
Yes.
Great, good. Okay, so I'm going to start essentially with a presentation about worldview that is mostly about systems thinking and complexity, which are the sciences of interconnectedness. The idea being that we need to get used to seeing the world in a different way currently the kind of the societal habit is often to see things not connected, to see things separately and so on. But seeing things in a more connected fashion can help us think about collaboration in a different way. And for those of you who are new to systems and complexity, and I know that many of you are not, the idea for this is not so much that you would become experts in these fields, but more that the point is to develop the ability to see interconnectedness and to recognize consistently that nothing is separate, nothing exists without context, and then to be able to apply that recognition to working with other people. And I'll mention this a lot as we go on, but there's a really direct link between recognizing interconnectedness and getting good at the network and essential skills categories. It's really all of a piece. That, seeing that everything is interconnected, that it's, a big interconnected system helps you act systemically in a way that's more effective when we're talking about collaboration. And seeing relationship in one aspect of all this helps you see and attend to the relationships in the other aspects as well. And I think just generally seeing interconnectedness helps us awaken more empathy, which is another really important aspect of collaboration. So hopefully this becomes clear as I go along. And especially because some of what I'm about to present is abstract, but I think that you'll see that it has quite concrete ramifications as we go forward. And as Devin said, feel free to use the chat box to ask questions as we're going forward, and we'll stop at a few points to look at those questions. All right, so imagine you've been shipwrecked and you're floating in a lifeboat. It's cold, it's dark, it's windy, and you think to yourself, I should start a fire. I could get warm, there would be light, that would make this situation much better. The other people in the boat strenuously object to this idea. But you want to do what you want to do, and you want to be warmer than you are, so you start a fire. And at first, this seems to work out pretty well. It does make you more warm, and it does provide some light. But not too soon after that, of course, it burns a hole in the hull, and the boat sinks, and now you're really cold and wet and in danger, and the rest of the people who were in the boat are quite unhappy with you. So, what happened here? The fire didn't just warm you. Other things happened as well. The fire affected the rest of the boat. And of course, even though the fire worked in the moment, not too much later, just a little bit into the future, it didn't work. And you didn't really pay attention to how boats work. And so this kind of decision comes from a certain mindset, a worldview, in fact, in which we see things as separate and don't see their connections. And this is kind of a habit in which we, instead of thinking about how things are connected in time or space, that we use very narrow boundaries of consideration instead. So in this image, that blue dot is the thing you might be thinking of, and the square, the box, is the narrow boundaries of your consideration. So in that mode, we might ask, will this antibiotic kill a particular bacterial infection? Or will this dam provide electricity or water? Or will this artificial fertilizer make my crops grow faster? Or if we do this thing, will our company profit this quarter? Or if I yell at this person, will they do what I want? And actually, this is a powerful way to think about things. To separate everything else out and just to make a decision about the thing that you are concerned about. It can be quite clarifying. But of course it has a downside, because the world is actually connected and not separate. And decisions that are based on information that only comes from within the narrow boundaries ignores reality. It doesn't take into account the web of relationship that the thing in question is actually a part of. And so you all know that antibiotics don't just kill bacterial infections, but can also lead to the development of superbugs. Using artificial fertilizer can lead to dead zones as well as growing crops. This group, probably more than many, knows that dams don't just do whatever they're designed to do, but damage ecosystems, stop fish passage, all that kind of thing. And companies are always, often paying attention to only profit or something like that, and not paying attention to what else happens from their actions, social, ecological disasters, and so on. And yelling at someone to get them to do what you want, it could be successful, but something else is going to happen at some point. It may just be that you have to hire a new administrative assistant every 6 months because nobody wants to work with you. But the point is, there's other things that will happen. And there's nothing wrong with focusing in on one thing to make a decision about. That's one good way of knowing. But it can't be the only way of knowing, and that's often the case in our habit of thinking. It's dangerous when it becomes a worldview, because seeing just the one thing and not the context is just inaccurate. It's not a good way to make decisions. So a better way to make decisions is to see the antibiotics or the dams or the fertilizer or whatever as part of a larger pattern, and to see the dynamics of that pattern. From going to having the narrow boundaries to seeing this bigger web. And some things only appear when we look at that level. So superbugs, for instance, only appear when we look at a whole population of people, not an individual. And whether we understand that something is separate or that something is part of this larger web really influences our decisions. It influences design and policy and basically everything we do and make in society. So if you remember nothing else about this, that movement from box or web, super important. Everything exists within a larger context. So if you're thinking about systems, there are essentially 3 aspects to systems. Those are parts, interconnections, and function or purpose. In this image, the nodes, the dots are the parts, and the links there are the interconnections. And every system functions in some kind of way. And we usually use purpose when we're talking about human designed systems. And of course, those even, they might be designed for a certain purpose, but function in some other way as well. But what's useful about this particular way of looking at things is that it applies to a lot of different things. So your body is a system. It has different parts that are all connected, and your body functions in a certain kind of way. Some of our bodies function better than others, but still. A school is a system. The economy, businesses, ecosystems, cities, cars, all of these things have parts that are connected, and they function in some kind of way, or were designed for a certain kind of purpose. And in any of these situations, if you do something that addresses only one part of the system and doesn't take into account the rest, there's a chance that it may backfire, that there will be unintended consequences. So let's just stop there with that much. And what I'd love for you all to do is just think of an example of something in which we think of it as a separate thing and ignore the bigger picture, ignore the larger context. And if you can think of an example like that, put it in the chat box. And we'll look at those answers in just a second. What's something that we think of as a separate thing and ignore the bigger picture? And in a minute, we'll have Sean look at some of those answers. So there are a lot of elements to thinking systemically, a lot of ways to think about that. And that boat example actually gives us a few principles to start with. The first one is what you do in one part of the system affects the whole, because it's all interconnected, right? And that's pretty easy to see with the boat. Another one is what you do now affects the future. So you start the fire in the boat, a little bit later, things happen that you don't want, that are negative. So in other words, things are connected, not just in space, but also in time. And then also, you have to act within the constraints of the system if you want it to continue to function. And in order to kind of understand all this, we have to recognize that the boat and everything is a unity. And that's what is difficult for us sometimes. And when we do that, a lot of the principles that I'm going to lay out and how they, what they have to do with collaboration is going to become pretty self-evident. And of course, the reason that the boat is a funny example is that you already wouldn't set it on fire unless you're a dope. But the point is, are we able to recognize some of these principles, the fact of interconnectedness, about the rest of the world? There's an opportunity to take this logic to conclusion and see that interconnectedness is a fundamental quality of the world. And of course, this logic is quite useful for us because it describes moving toward landscape stewardship. You don't just steward one property because it exists in the context of the greater landscape. And generally, if you're looking at the greater landscape, then it's not just the purview of one organization. And then there's a whole web of organizations that are all relating to each other in one way or another. So understanding this kind of logic helps us understand why we would collaborate to begin with. One example of this kind of thing is what we're doing in the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network. And I know many other people on this call have done this in their collaborations as well, is we're doing some mapping. We're getting LiDAR flown and ortho imagery, taking in other data to eventually create a bunch of data products, including fine-scale veg maps. So we'll have really good data for the whole region that will help us contextualize the individual properties and projects that happen within our region. This isn't the only way to think about the concept of seeing the bigger picture, but it's one kind. It's a good example of it. So now, Sean, if you would be so kind, if there are any examples to read, let's hear some of those.
Thanks, Dylan. Unless I'm looking at a different chat box, I'm not really seeing a lot of examples come in right now from the group. So if people want to reflect back on that for a minute, I think a lot of people were tuning into what you were saying, Dylan, and maybe not reflecting so much on the question, which was, if I recall, is essentially looking for an idea or an item that we feel like exists pretty much in isolation and we don't necessarily think about the connections with that. Is that a decent paraphrasing?
Yep, exactly.
So similar to the example of the fire and the boat at the beginning.
Indeed.
So here we have one about, well, we've got a couple coming in now. So modern medicine, focusing on treating symptoms rather than addressing the root cause.
Fantastic example.
Yeah, so like using pharmaceuticals rather than changing diet and lifestyle. And another idea is, we often think about a specific management or stewardship action on one property and think that that's kind of its own thing, its own system that's not related to other elements of our work.
Love it.
And another one here, thinking more about our work at different granular levels. And so often we think about preservation of a species, but not really connecting that to the system or the habitat that supports that species.
Absolutely. Those are great. Thanks, Sean. Unless there's other ones that you really want to call out.
I think, oh, we've got another one here, wildfires. So thinking about the direct cause of those, such as lightning causing a wildfire or down power line, instead of thinking about root causes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so now they're really coming in. So I just encourage people to continue to grab these as they come to mind, and we'll be sure to save the chat at the end of this. But really, really good examples about things that we tend to see in isolation and aren't seeing the bigger picture. Do want to just thank, Chris, Lisa, Darcy, Ariana, Michelle, Ben, Maria, and others for jumping in on this. It's great to see the activity in the chat box.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Sean. Okay, so once we go beyond thinking about things as separate and start to notice that, effects keep on going, we can see that one thing can affect the next, and so on, like dominoes. And so a really powerful question is, what else will happen if we do this thing, whatever thing it is? What else will happen? What else does this affect? Because it is often the case that one thing can affect the next, and so on and so on. So here's an example. This is the Mississippi River Basin. Throughout this region and throughout a lot of the country, farmers are putting artificial fertilizer in their fields and to help the crops grow. But artificial fertilizer doesn't break down very easily. So when it rains, it washes into the streams and into the river and into the Mississippi River, and then finally into the Gulf of Mexico, where it keeps fertilizing, and it fertilizes algae. And when algae grows, it sucks oxygen out of the water, and everything else around it dies. And so you can have huge dead zones, like 600 square miles. And then, of course, there are the folks who are fishing, who are putting around, trying to find their fish, can't find anything, which has a negative impact on them, but also a negative impact on the economies of that Gulf region. And one thing to think about this then is there's a certain way in which we're already in collaboration with each other. Our actions together are always creating the state of things. So one way to look at this kind of dead zone thing is that it's the result of not great collaboration, right? People not being conscious of that, not taking a landscape stewardship perspective. And I'm not blaming farmers, because there's also a bigger system, a bigger food system in which there are pressures to use those kind of inputs and so on. So we're just talking about this one piece. But nonetheless, it does have these negative effects that are unintended. So it's a good thing, whether you are in a formal collaboration or not, to ask, what else might happen if I do this? It's a good practice. And it's the first step to thinking collaboratively, because you can't not affect the people around you. And so one version of this might be this, where you're doing something that has effects. Another version might be that you're interrupting a system that's already functioning well. So an example of this is that land management organizations are having a difficult time working across the US-Mexico border. It used to be fairly routine for US organizations to work with their Mexican counterparts and to cross the border, go down and meet with people, and then come back in a fairly short amount of time. But these days, funding for that kind of cross-border work has dried up, and the Border Patrol is being much more aggressive than it used to be, and subjecting people from US organizations who cross back to long bouts of questioning that makes it much less practical to do that kind of work. And so as such, then the ecosystems that cross the border are suffering. So it's another example of things that might be done that don't necessarily have a certain kind of intention, but still cause these other kind of effects. All right, so we've been talking about kind of simple causality, one thing affects the next and so on. The next thing I want to talk about is feedback. And feedback is just one step more complex, in which one thing affects the next, but then that thing comes back to affect the first thing. Sometimes it's called reciprocal causality if we're using fancy language, but generally just referred to as feedback, where the causality is going around in a loop. A affects B, but then B also affects A. And there's two kinds of feedback, reinforcing and balancing. I'll talk about those in just a second. But just generally, it's just a good reminder that whatever you do is going to come back to you in some way. And there can be, a single loop or multiple loops and so on. So it can become quite complex when we start to think about these kind of effects. And so if the first question that I suggested was important is what else might happen? We can add to that another question, which is how will this feed back? If A is going to affect B, how's B going to come back and affect A? And this becomes really important when we're talking about our own actions, because of course we're always having an effect and it's likely to come back. So reinforcing feedback. Reinforcing feedback is any kind of vicious or virtuous cycle where things just keep going and going in the same direction. So examples are like bunnies having babies, so there's more bunnies, so they have more babies, more babies, more bunnies, more babies, more bunnies, et cetera, et cetera. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. The rich have money to invest, so they get more money, so they have more money to invest. It's a cycle that continues in the same direction all the time. Exercise could be that way. You exercise, so you feel good, so you exercise more, so you feel better. An actor who gets parts, and therefore she is more well-known, so she gets more parts. So she's more well-known, so she gets parts. These are all examples of reinforcing feedback. This image on this slide is an example of redlining. Redlining was the racist practice that happened earlier in the 20th century, in which banks or some other entities sometimes would just draw a line around Black neighborhoods. And with banks would just say, we're not going to give any loans to people in this neighborhood because they're just not good candidates for loans. It didn't matter how great any individual was. They had just decided that the whole neighborhood wouldn't get a loan. And so in that way, people in that neighborhood had a hard time buying homes or starting businesses. They didn't have the capital to do so. And so if there's no new business, there's no new homes, it's hard to build the wealth that would allow the neighborhood to recover and get in good shape, which would then provide the logic for the bank to say, right, we shouldn't give any loans to this neighborhood, and that cycle would just continue. And in fact, we can actually see the effects of that practice as a cycle that continues even until now, in which Black families have been locked out of homeownership, for instance, such that they're much less likely to have homes to give to their children, so that there's still a disparity in Black and white homeownership even now. So once again, we can see that these things are connected over time. One thing that's useful about seeing feedback in this way is that we can look at the system and possibly intervene more effectively. So if you imagine that you are a nonprofit that went into this neighborhood and wanted to help it out, perhaps the nonprofit might go in and say, we should offer, there's no new businesses here, we should offer entrepreneurial skills courses for the residents of the neighborhood. But that would just be looking only at the fact of no new businesses as a thing that is separate from everything else. But if they were to zoom out and see this feedback loop, they could see that that might not be the most helpful thing. Or at the very least, it would have to be done along with new grants or loans or something that would provide the capital that would actually intervene in this pattern and shift it to a different pattern, a more positive pattern. So this is a useful way to just look at any situation and see what might be going on there. So that's reinforcing feedback. Balancing feedback is it's the same kind of situation in which one thing is affecting the other and that thing's affecting the first thing. But this time, a lot of the movements happen in opposition to each other. And so this image up here of a furnace in a room is a pretty classic example of balancing feedback. So whatever temperature the room is, that affects whether the furnace will turn off and on. And if the furnace turns off or on, that affects the temperature of the room. So they're always affecting each other, but it's always opposite. If the room is cold, the furnace turns on. And if the furnace turns on, it warms up the room. And if the room is warm, the furnace turns off. So it's always going back and forth. It's always balancing each other out. And you can see in this image that it says thermostat setting. That's setting the balance point, right? That's saying this is what we're trying to balance to. And of course, there's a sensor there so that the feedback can be read. You know, if there's no sensor, the furnace might just, you know, go and go and go, just boiling the room over, you know, over a long period of time. So that's the basic idea of balancing feedback. And what I'd like to do now is just do a small little exercise to, for another example of balancing feedback. So I'd like everyone to try this, unless you have some kind of injury or something that does not allow you to take care of yourself. But everybody stand up. And go ahead, actually stand up. That's right, I can see a lot of y'all, so really stand. And what I want you to do, make sure you're not gonna bump into anything, is just balance on one foot. And just balance there. And then what I want you to do is close your eyes. And notice how much more difficult that is. So let's try that again. If you're still balancing, great for you, but you can stop. And we're gonna do it one more time. All right, everybody balance on one foot. And then you know it's coming this time, so prepare, get yourself, you know, emotionally ready, and close your eyes. And try to stay balanced. And that's good. And then you can rest, and then you can sit back down. Good job. All right, so balancing can be represented as a balancing feedback loop. It's actually exactly like the furnace. So in the same way that whatever state the room was in tells the furnace what to do, and then the furnace affects the room, wherever you are in space tells you where you're going to move, and then wherever you move moves you to a different place in space. And so if your balance point is straight up and down, if you're moving too much to the left, you balance it out by moving to the right. If you're too far forward, you balance it out by moving to the back, and so on, right? So it's always wherever you are in space affects where you move, which affects where you are in space, which affects where you move, and you're always adjusting, trying to keep that balance point of staying straight up and down. And essentially, you have two sensors. In the same way there was a sensor for the furnace, you have two sensors that help you do that. One is proprioception, which is just how the body knows where it is in space. And the other is your vision. And so when we closed your eyes, it's just much harder to stay balanced. You still have proprioception, so you can do it. It's just a lot more difficult. And if you found it impossible, you just might not be used to trying to do that. So, but I promise, you know, if for whatever reason this is a talent that you wanted to develop, if you practice balancing on one foot with your eyes closed, you can do it. It is possible. But so then we can both see the balancing thing here, and we can also see it's really important to have a way to read the feedback. So imagine something like putting gas in your car, that when you see it's full, you don't fill up the tank. When you see it's empty, you fill up the tank, right? It's the same kind of balancing feedback. But if your gas gauge is broken, then you don't have the sensor there that allows you to make that decision. Thirst is a balancing feedback loop. Hunger. In fact, anything that has a goal can be represented as, I mean, anytime you have a goal, anytime you're making a purposeful decision, you could represent that as a balancing feedback loop, because you're always seeing how close you are to the goal, which affects your actions to get toward the goal, which helps you then see where you are in relationship to it, and so on and so on. That loop is always happening. So that's that's balancing feedback. So we've got reinforcing and balancing feedback. There's a lot of ways to use this concept of feedback. The primary reason that I'm talking about it is simply that because it's a really important part of understanding interconnectedness. And as I said before, I think developing this ability to see interconnectedness helps us understand collaboration. But one just specific example out of many possibilities is you might use this to ask, how does our organization engage with other organizations? You know, do you know? Are you getting good feedback? This is especially important for big and powerful organizations to ask, because you might want to take a look and see if you've got the right sensor. A lot of times for big and powerful organizations, their partner organizations can't afford to give them honest feedback because it's too vulnerable for them. They might lose the resources that they get from the big organizations. So can you put something in place that would actually help you get the good feedback that you need for this? The other thing I want to say, well, two things I want to say about feedback. One is this starts to get us away from really simple causality, and we start getting a little bit more complex, which is good. We're going to keep going in that direction. The other thing is that feedback is such a huge issue that we could do the whole workshop just on that. So it's a little bit of a crime for me just to talk about it for 5 minutes, but what are you going to do? And then now what I'd like to do is actually turn this over to Yakuta Poonawalla from the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. And she's just going to give us a little example of her work and how this concept of feedback might relate to that. So take it away, Yakuta.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be in this space with all of you. I'm Yakuta Poonawalla, and I have the wonderful opportunity of working with the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, and I see a lot of my colleagues here. So I feel at ease and calm, but I also know that each one of us, it's 41 of us, and we have many commonalities, and one of them is just our love and passion for nature. So that binds us together in this virtual space. I want to acknowledge that we live in challenging times, and speaking about collaborative leadership and relationship building is something that we would love to do in person, but here we are in this virtual space talking about connections and relationship building and trust and compassion and empathy. And what I'm really hoping to share is an example of something that we tried in the Conservancy early on in the pandemic, keeping in mind that everything would happen virtually, and how do you break down barriers to build relationships in this disconnected time. So early on in the pandemic, we at the many of us in the Conservancy realized how disconnected we felt, and how all our work really was dependent on seeing each other and building those relationships and talking to each other and listening to each other. And so we thought, hey, let's get together in the virtual space and have conversations on a weekly basis. And we created something that we started calling a community circle. And community circles go way back for me. I grew up in a community where we would not all eat independently or individually from a plate. We would sit in a circle and there would be a large plate. So imagine if you've been to an Ethiopian restaurant, there's a plate served and 4 or 5 people sit around, and then food is placed in the center, and then each one of you takes food on your side and then eats from that plate and shares that plate. So I think of it as collaborative eating. And so in the community, we would all sit around, and 6 to 8 of us would sit around, and the food was placed in the center, and we would all take it to our side and eat together. And that is when circles started becoming really important in my life. And then I learned from my mother who had her circle of friends, all women. And I grew up in India, and in India, women have a very difficult place and are often not seen as those with power and leadership, those who have the ability to give feedback and suggestions. And so she had her circle of friends, her women friends, and they would meet on a monthly basis and rotate in each other's homes. They would meet, they would cook a meal, they would share ideas, they would share their challenges that they were facing in their lives. And there was shared leadership and there was shared power with each other. And she would come back every time from that circle with a smile on her face. So those two early examples in my life really helped me understand what it meant to create circles where you could share, where you could collaborate, and you could give feedback to each other, and there was an understanding. And where I'm getting at with these two examples is now when I create these community circles every week, we're thinking a lot about what it means to hold power and what it means to share feedback when you have an organization where you have leadership and you have directors and then you have staff. And in a time when we are all connecting virtually, how is that feedback given to leadership from staff when you can't really have those meetings, where you can't have those spaces to share? And so the community circles started becoming this place where we started thinking about who's holding power and how is this power distributed, and how do we get to learn about each other and share this power with each other, so that the changes that we really want to see at an institutional level, at an organizational level, can start spreading beyond this circle. And we had circles every week. We started talking about, we started learning first about each other, and there were themes every week. So we would have themes from anywhere from like sharing of a ritual or sharing of our stories, of our culture. And soon we started thinking about what are some things that we need to see change at an institutional level. And this was also the time when nationwide we were seeing a lot of challenges come up due to the racial injustice issues that we were seeing. And so we felt the need to come together even more, and many of our staff expressed interest in having affinity spaces. And so we shifted from multi-faith, multiracial circles to affinity spaces where our people of color, Black and Indigenous communities created a circle, and many of our white staff who were aspiring to be co-conspirators or allies created their own circle and started sharing their thoughts and giving feedback of what needs to happen at an individual level, the growth that needs to happen at an individual level, but also at an institutional level. And I'm really proud of those circles because they helped in sharing power and leadership. And I've been thinking a lot over the years about, and I'm sure each one of you have heard about the 3 or 4 different types of power. And especially now, I've been thinking a lot about them. I'm thinking about how, when we use the word power, we think about power over something. And so when there's power over something, the rest of the folks who are involved in that relationship often feel like they're doing something against their will. But a lot of what I was seeing in these community circles and what I'm seeing in collaborative and transformative leadership is the power with each other, where we're sharing power together to build something. And then the power to, which is more about power to change something, power to create something. And then lastly, early on, many of us mentioned when Sean asked us that question about compassion and empathy and building those values, which I really see as power from within, which is often unheard and unseen. And so when we started talking about these 4 different types of power, it was easier to acknowledge leadership. It was easier to acknowledge the power that people held, but also get our leadership to be with us together and help change happen from within. And so I wanted to share this example, mainly because I feel like when we think about collaborative leadership, we think about, and what is already mentioned is that when we start thinking about power and privilege and what it means to collaborate, we often think about two different types, which is only power over or shared power, but there's also power to and power from within, which I'm really seeing play out in these circles that we've been holding. And I'd be happy to talk more if you're interested in learning more about how we've used these circles as a tool to really start dialogues and discussions that are helping us think about the environmental and conservation world in a very holistic way, and think about intersectional environmentalism, which is very much needed right now. So I'll stop there and see if any questions come up. And again, happy to share more about what we're doing and how it's really helping us think about the interconnectedness. And many of you brought this up in the chat as well, but how do you really think about that feedback loop, but also think about that interconnectedness and think about shared power in this work?
Yakuta, that's so great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I love this example, both of feedback and just interconnectedness generally. Sean, I don't know if you're looking at the chat box, but if there's maybe time for one or two questions for Yakuta, maybe we could do that.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan. I'm looking at some of them. A lot of people are just really, I think, seeing themselves or their work in the words that Yakuta shared with us. So we had a comment just about how her words and her experience was so relevant to the conversations that others have been having that that example really speaks to the importance of connections and interconnectedness and relationship building as a foundation for change, so that we need to just listen and understand and connect in that way. We did have one question just asking, Yakuta, if you could just reflect one more time on the 4 dimensions of power that you highlighted, and maybe we could capture those in the chat for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm happy to type them in chat so that everyone can see, but it's power over, power with, power to, and power from within. And something that I didn't mention, I mentioned it in so many ways, but I think it's important to just acknowledge it, is how in relationships where there is leadership and there are staff and there's director and there's an organizational structure. It's what we're learning is that it's really key for staff to feel that they have that safe space to give the feedback, and for leadership to really receive that feedback in an open and authentic way. And so that can only happen when that power is shared. So yeah, I'll type that in the chat box.
Yeah, and maybe, Yakuta, while you're thinking about that, one other question came up that I think overlaps with another comment made earlier, and it was more around what really made these successful? How did you set them up in a way where people could feel that safety and be honest with each other, especially recognizing that a lot of people enter into these conversations really with their own interests in mind, and they may not be in a space where they're thinking about connections, but maybe they're in a place where they're really just trying to assert their own point of view. So how did you navigate some of those challenges?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I feel like it's a practice and it's something that's growing and we're all learning together. But I think early on, the reason that they've been so successful is because they are staff-led. And we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee in the Parks Conservancy. And so this idea came from staff within the community. And there was, right from the beginning, there was no barrier to set them up. And we had full support from everyone within the organization. And so it was staff-led, And early on, we started using our community agreements, which are agreements or guidelines or values that we led these circles by. So values such as making sure that everyone feels emotionally and physically safe, making sure that any kind of power dynamic is addressed right from the beginning, making sure that if someone is harmed, there's a place that staff can go to or a person that they can go to, and that we can acknowledge that right in that moment. And so we started with community agreements, and there was a shared understanding. And I think when that happens, you're really setting a foundation and then growing as a circle. And so every time staff came into those circles, we would start with that agreement and make sure that everyone felt like they had a say in those community agreements, and then we would continue with our conversations. And they were led with a lot of care and intention and thought, and the hope was that if harm was done, or if someone felt that if they felt isolated or if they felt uncomfortable, we would address it either through a one-on-one conversation or through a group conversation. So safety and trust is something that takes a lifetime to build, and we're still not there yet. But we're working towards it. We're making it part of our culture. We're making it a practice that we practice regularly, so that it becomes just a part of our culture and how we lead our discussions in the future.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for that. I know there's some other questions coming into the chat. I think we are going to move on, but just this whole issue of power within collaborative culture and within society in general is such an interesting conversation, and one that really does require us to really bring our full awareness into that conversation. So we've got our traditional, maybe hierarchical power dynamics versus some of the more collaborative ones that we're talking about, the four that Yakata introduced as well, are really critical to help us understand relationship and therefore understanding and connection. So with that, Dylan, I'm gonna pass it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Yakutov. Such a great example. I love it. Yeah, I feel like we could do the whole workshop just on those community circles, so really compelling. I'm gonna share my screen again. Okay, yeah, so the next thing I want to talk about, we've been talking about different kinds of connectedness. The fact that things aren't separate, and then we've kind of talked about sort of like the domino effect kind of thing. We've talked about feedback. And as we talk about systems, you know, we can talk about how a bunch of things can be connected and therefore be a system. What's also true is that system can then be connected to other systems. It can be a part too of larger systems, and so on and so on. The fact is that systems are often nested, like Russian nesting dolls. And this is especially true with natural systems. And then what happens then is there's a hierarchy, a dependency chain within those kinds of nested systems. So for instance, you could have a cell that is a part of a liver, that's a part of a body, that's a part of a family, that's a part of society, and so on. And the dependency comes in when you think of, you know, for instance, your liver, it's semi-autonomous. You can kind of think of it as a thing. It's different than the kidneys or the pancreas or something like that. On the other hand, it exists entirely within the context of the body and is dependent on the body. So the liver can't just decide to go get its own apartment or something, right? It's totally dependent on the body. And if the liver did have a little brain in which it was making decisions, and it started to make decisions that were bad for the body, that wouldn't be great because it depends on the body for its existence. And this kind of dependency and understanding that the purposes of subsystems need to be in alignment with the greater system. In systems thinking, this is called coherence, when the different levels of the systems are aligned. And obviously, a pretty good example of incoherence, excuse me, is any kind of unsustainable behavior that we're involved in environmentally. You know, when we're damaging the system that we depend on, it's incoherent. It's setting fire to the boat. And in fact, I think this idea of coherence, of kind of understanding this dependence, is really fundamental for moving toward a society that is guided by sustainability and equity and well-being. If we are really understanding that we're always dependent, never independent, never separate, it's never the case. We're always in this dependent relationship in a certain sense. And of course, this is true at a grand scale, the sustainability of the world and all that, but it also can be true at the level of your relationships with your collaborative partners. So keeping coherence in mind, keeping the fact that systems are inside of systems and so on, can really help us make decisions. So we have to make sure our actions are not at cross purposes with the goals of the systems we depend on. So this is just kind of, it's almost like a meditative question sometimes to kind of feel into, what does this mean, you know, to be coherent? What is coherent? What are actions that support what we depend on? So just as an example, if your organization depends on collaboration to achieve its goals, does it do things to support its partners, to support relationships with its partners? So for example, let's say you're partnering with another organization on a project, but then your organization creates communications that doesn't mention your partner about that project. You know, is that a coherent approach? No, because you're possibly damaging that relationship on which you depend to get your goals done. So it's not just sort of that, you know, that's rude. It's also just sort of functional, right? It's not a functional thing to do. Another way to explore this idea is to ask, do the actions of my organization consistently reflect its stated principles? So it's one thing to state principles, which are often about things like sustainability and equity and well-being and so on, but then it's another thing to go down a level to the actual actions. You know, are those supporting those kinds of things? Because I think there's something about good citizenship that's really, whether individual or organization, that's about this kind of idea of coherence, about supporting the larger systems that we depend on, whether that's a functioning society or it's the planet or whatever. The other reason that I'm pointing this out, the systems nestedness bit, is that, you know, so we've talked about simple connectedness and we've talked about feedback, and now this is yet another way in which things are connected. And if you can start to feel those different ways that we are connected and how many different things it covers, maybe you can start to get a sense of intimacy between you and everything. And then what happens when you can sense that intimacy of connection is those questions about, do your actions support, you know, the larger things you depend on, start to become more meaningful. You can ask questions about, you know, do the ends justify the means? This is often sort of, we think like, oh, well, I could do this, it's okay, because we're going to get to this positive outcome. But when we start to see that everything is so connected, that doesn't make the same kind of sense. You know, often when people are talking about ends versus means, we get to sort of philosophical questions like, does it make sense to try to achieve peace through violence? And from this kind of systems perspective, no, it definitely doesn't. That's a really incoherent way to go about things, because even if we accept that the getting rid of the bad guys or whatever that we might do with violence is a good thing, there are always going to be these other effects, you know, right? And there's violence causes trauma and societal repression. You know, it doesn't just stop. People, in the, you know, after the violence will want to take revenge. You know, there's all these other things that happen. You can't just decide to focus only on the effects that you want. You have to see everything that's going to be there. So the point here is your actions have to be consistent with your goals. If you want to make the pattern that is what you're trying to achieve, then your actions have to reflect that. So if we settle down a notch and maybe from violent insurrection or whatever to just talking about your organization's approach to collaboration, is that approach reflective of what you hope to get out of it? For instance, does your organization give the kind of support to collaborative projects that will lead to success? Like, do you as a practitioner have enough bandwidth to do collaboration, or is it always this kind of extra thing that you're trying to do? Is it an afterthought? Is your organization respectful of collaborative partners, or does it just hope to use them for a specific outcome of some kind? And again, my point is not just that like those things are distasteful, but that what you do is you're building in outcomes by how you attend to relationships. So in a moment, we're going to talk about complexity, which brings us another step into this kind of intimacy where we can feel how connected we are to everything and how meaningful our actions are when we're trying to work with each other. But I want to pause for just a moment so that you all can ask whatever questions that you'd like about what we've talked about so far. If you haven't put questions in the chat box yet, this is your opportunity. And so, Sean, if you'd like to pull out some questions, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan, for taking a break and checking in with the group. Really good conversations, some of them following from Yakuta's presentation and just asking for some more detail. Some of them asking about things that are going on in their world with their community, thinking about other insights and tools that they can share with one another. Really interesting conversation just about how do we engage in people in an inclusive way in this time around some of the technology and physical and institutional challenges that we're facing. And so I think people are really starting to apply the context of what you're saying to their work and then really contemporizing it in this moment. So let's see if there's any specific questions I can draw out. And people who are listening in, if there's anything you'd like Dylan to extrapolate on, now's a good time.
It's also fine if there's not, there's more to come. So,
Yeah, I almost feel like it's more of a dialogue than a Q&A, and it's nice to see people moving through the chat space by sharing examples and ideas with each other and integrating your thoughts as they go. So I'll let you know if a good question comes up, but I think we can go ahead and move forward.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. All right, so we've been talking about what's essentially systems thinking, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about complexity. And complexity is not distinct from systems thinking exactly. It's more of an emphasis. And I'm just going to keep getting a little bit more abstract and nerdy as I go along, but I feel like it really applies to the work we're doing. So I hope that you feel that way too as we go forward. All right, so if we talked earlier about one thing affecting the next or about feedback or whatever, but what if a bunch of things are all affecting each other all at the same time? When this happens, everything's affecting each other. You can't really say which is the cause and which is the effect because everything's going on all at once. And this becomes much more complex than like the series of dominoes kind of thing and that sort of thing. And so this is complexity, and complexity is a giant field with a lot of complicated math. We're mostly not going to get into it. We're just going to stick with this one idea here that has two parts that you can see in this slide. And the first is a system is complex when the pattern of interactions between parts of a system creates a new level of order And then the second bit of it is this new level of order results in systematic distances or delays between cause and effect in space or time. And that first bit is basically saying when a bunch of things interact, something's going to come out of that that wouldn't have happened otherwise. There will be a pattern that arises from that, even if you can't track it. And the second part is essentially saying, and you can't track it. The second part is saying that when all that is happening, it's very different. It's very difficult to say what is causing what. And that's a key part of complexity. So a good example of this first bit, the pattern of interactions leading to a new level of order, is pedestrians in a busy crosswalk. Imagine Manhattan or some big city. Light turns green and dozens of people start walking toward each other across the crosswalk. They don't bump into each other. They all kind of sidestep each other. The first line sidesteps the first line as they meet, and then the people behind them kind of line up behind. And if you stopped in the middle and took a picture, what you would see is an interweaving of lines moving in different directions. And so this interweaving, this kind of braided thing, that's a new level of order that just simply arises from people trying to walk across the street. They're just interacting with each other. And no one's trying to make it happen. If aliens were watching us, and they might be like, look at these patterns these creatures like to make, so beautiful, these braided patterns. But no one's making these decisions. It just arises from the interaction of all these different agents, the different pedestrians, right? Another thing that's interesting about that is that actually what's happening is a balancing feedback loop for each person. Each person is trying to get across the street, and as they try, they're sensing whether they're there yet or not, or they're bonking into someone, and that changes what they do, and that changes how close they are to the goal, and so on. So all these different balancing feedback loops all the time, everybody adjusting in the same way that you were adjusting when you were trying to balance. All of that then helps create this new level of order. Another example of this is kind of the classic example, is bird flocking. So there's sort of a similar thing where birds are following a few rules, where they're trying to keep a minimum distance from other birds. They're trying to fly at the same speed in the same direction as the other birds. They're trying to keep to the center of the flock. And just that is what creates this kind of flocking behavior that we see, that we find quite beautiful. But the birds aren't making an aesthetic choice, right? It's just arising from how they interact. It's a self-organizing process. Ant hives are another example. The hive for ants, very complex. There can be chimneys that allow sort of the bad air out, and others that allow, fresh air intake. There can be different chambers, this one's a graveyard, this is where we keep the food, etc. Ant hives are more complex than a single ant can conceive of, but they arise from the interaction of the ants together. And what's interesting about this is that if you put just a couple of ants down into a situation, they won't start doing hive behavior. They won't start making hives. There has to be a critical mass of ants for that to happen. And you can kind of see that in pedestrians too. If there's only 5 pedestrians, they're not going to start doing the braided weaving thing of different lines because they don't need to. It only arises out of necessity. So all these are examples of interactions that start to lead to some new level of order. And it's self-organized. There's not really a design going on. An example that demonstrates the second part of this, the bit about the distances or delays in space or time. Climate change is a good example of that, where if you were to drive to the supermarket today, the carbon molecules that you released, we couldn't exactly track those molecules to a specific weather event sometime in the future. Because that's not really how it works, right? Like the molecules mix with other molecules, and trap heat, and that amplifies various weather patterns. And then there's ultimately some weather event, so 40 years in the future, there's a rainstorm that happens. You just can't say that that was caused by specific molecules. You can't track it. There's too much going on. And that's what happens with complexity, is that there's too much going on to exactly track how things work. And that's usually what we really like. We really like more simple cause and effect. We like things to be more machine-like because it makes us feel more certain. And so one of the reasons to focus on this is to actually get out of that certainty and to see that things arise in this other kind of fashion. And one reason, hopefully this is kind of obvious, but one reason to talk about this is that it pretty much describes exactly how networks work. It's a bunch of different people and organizations all interacting. They create new patterns of collaboration, new projects, and so on. And so it's useful to go a little bit deeper into how this all works. How does all this interaction happen? And now I'm going to get really nerdy. So, just hang out with me, stay with me here. This is an example of a cellular automata. And the way this works is that if you look at the top of the image, there's those rectangles that go across. And each rectangle is a rule that then gets applied to create the pattern below. That first rectangle on the left, you can see 3 black squares and then a white square in the middle beneath it. And so that's the rule. The rule is if there are 3 black squares, the square in the middle beneath it will be white. And as you go across on each rectangle, each one of those is a different rule. And if we start with 1 black square at the top of that graph in the middle, as those rules are applied, that's the pattern that starts to come out. And then if there are more iterations, we can see more of the pattern. And if there's a different set of rules, then we get a different pattern. Each time we change the rules, we get a different pattern that arises. So you can kind of see that whatever you start with, that's what dictates the pattern. And we can start to think about how this might apply to collaboration. So what we start with might be our essential skills, the behavioral and emotional capacities we bring to the table. Or it might be whether our organization recognizes collaboration as valuable or not. It might be whether we've met in person or not. It might be how easy or difficult it is to get an MOU or interagency agreement signed. The point is that once you start to able to see this way, that you can start to see that all these things take on different import because it's going to create the pattern that arises. It's going to affect how we are able to work together. So different patterns, different rules. Some of these are simple, some of these are more complex. But just in case it totally seems abstract, it's also, look at this seashell here. It's exactly the same kind of patterning or very similar. So there's probably some kind of if-then kind of logic going on here. Like if there's calcium and some other mineral, then this triangle appears. And if these other minerals, then tiger stripe, something like that. I don't know. But in any case, it's, whatever started, whatever conditions were at play when this shell's forming, dictates how this pattern arises. So another example of this is autocatalysis, which is a theory by Stuart Kauffman, who's a complexity biologist. And he uses this term to describe his theory of how life emerged. And I put this picture of some ducklings and a kitty there because the actual diagram of autocatalysis is just more trouble than it's worth for our purposes. But in any case, he describes a situation in which prior to life, in some primordial ooze or a tide pool or whatever, there were different chemical molecules present that are all relating to each other. And they only have a couple different ways to relate to each other. They can come together or they can not. And then other ones can act as catalysts that help chemical molecules bond together or split them apart. And so just that much can start to create a pattern. that happens over time, that because it's the same molecules doing the same kind of interactions, that it will replicate over time. And that at some point it starts to look something like DNA, and then it goes from there. One of the interesting details of his theory is that if you start to imagine this pattern where some molecules are coming together, others are getting split apart, that some, when they get split apart, then might essentially be waste molecules, but there's another pattern nearby that uses it as a food molecule, so that there's ecosystem from the beginning, even prior to life, it's already ecosystemic. And so again, you can see that the qualities that these chemical molecules start with, that dictates the pattern, exactly like the cellular automata. So, you know, notice the similarity, right, between the cellular automata and the birds and what, you know, all these other things that we're talking about, that we might be talking about, like the conditions that are in place, or rules, or the qualities, but whatever is there to start with, that's what patterns are going to arise. And so chemical molecules can't choose their own qualities, but we can. There's a certain degree in which we can choose what to bring into a collaboration, and then choose what kind of patterns are going to arise. But one of the things I really want to emphasize about that is that it's the qualities or the conditions or the rules first, right? Then the pattern arises. So you actually, as a collaborator, have to make the leap. You know, a good pattern of interaction is going to require you to be generous first, participative first, transparent first, helpful first, before you know exactly what's going on. Sometimes in collaboration and networks and so on, you see some people kind of holding back, you know, leaning back, being in a bit of a transactional mode, kind of waiting to see if this is going to be valuable or not. But I'm just saying that's not going to work as well because of this dynamic, which takes place with us as much as it takes place with chemical molecules or cellular automata or whatever. Because the collaboration is not separate from you and your interactions with your partners. You're always creating how it's going to be. So your actions are quite meaningful, and they're meaningful before you know what's going on. So Stuart Kaufman, he talks about self-organization as the root source of order. In other words, it's not just, you know, chemical molecules or whatever. It's a lot of things that we see in the world are from self-organization. And if we know that, if that's one of the lessons we can take from looking at complexity, then we can work with that. We don't have to just think about designing or control of things in order to work with complexity. And this really applies to collaboration, because complex systems generally are difficult to control. You can think of the economy, for instance. You know, even the Fed, they can try to do things to affect it, and maybe they can affect it, but they can't control it perfectly. It's too complex. There are too many people buying and selling and innovating new things and putting regulation down and stealing stuff. Like there's so much going on. You just can't control it perfectly. And that's complex systems generally. So we have this nice quote here from Donella Meadows, who's a really important systems thinker. She says, "We can't control systems or figure them out, but we can dance with them." And so this is a major lesson of complexity. As I was saying earlier, people kind of want simple causality that would allow them to just do a thing. They could just do this one action that just solves it. They can just do some problem solving. They want an answer, even if it's a hard answer. But a lot of the lesson here for when we're collaborating is there's not just an answer or a way to control. It's that the way we participate actually produces the way that the collaborative pattern is going to come about. And the thing about this is that there's really an emotional or behavioral aspect to this, right? Like accepting that you can't control something, that's not easy. And also trying to work in a situation in which not just you don't have control, but none of your partners has control. And then you're asked to also start out, as I was saying earlier, being generous and participative and transparent. But actually, that actually demands a kind of mature response on our part to be able to do all those things. But that's kind of the deal. Excuse me, and as I was saying earlier, a bunch of people interacting who you can't control, a situation in which you have to have tolerance for ambiguity, that's a network. So understanding that collaborating in a network and other forms of collaboration is complex, how do we approach it? David Snowden, another great systems thinker, he has this nice quote. He says, "Leaders who try to impose order in a complex context will fail. But those who set the stage, step back a bit, allow patterns to emerge, and determine which ones are desirable will succeed." So if you're giving up control, it's not just that you're flailing in the dark, right? That you have no idea what's happening. It's that you're staying present, you're staying in relationship, you're listening, you're having the ability to do that, stepping back a bit to see what's happening. And as you see what's happening to it, you're responsive. So it's hugely important to be able to have that kind of listening disposition, that ability to step back and so on. David Snowden suggests that the way to work with complex systems is to do small experiments, to do iterative experiments, and they should be what he calls safe fail. So there's this term fail safe that means it can't fail, it's going to be good no matter what. But safe fail means it's fine if it fails. It's not going to, if this fails, it's not going to hurt us. The experiment is small enough that we're good. And then as you do these experiments, you see what works, and you keep working with that. And that which doesn't, you kind of dampen that pattern that's not as good, and then do something else, right? So for me, as I said earlier, I run the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network. This is exactly my approach to running the network. Is to try to do these experiments, see what happens, work with what happens, and things that don't work, you let those go. And so sometimes you might be in my role where you're designing those kind of experiments, and sometimes your job is to kind of go along with the process, which is also difficult. To be able to go, okay, we're just finding out, I'm going along with this, and we're going to see what happens. It's a bit messy. It relies on your participation. For me, you know, an example of these experiments have been as simple as just introducing topics for conversation. Fire and forest health, you know, do people want to talk about that? Is that something that enough network members want to talk about that we could move something forward on it? Or it might be a little bit bigger. In the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network, we do these salon events, which we cater snacks and drinks. They're very social. And we invite members to talk about specific issues. We've had salons on conservation grazing, on mountain biking. We did one on epic fails because no one wants to talk about their failures, and that was a pretty good one. And each one is its own experiment. You know, will people show up? Will they engage in conversation? Will something come out of it? And just the idea of having these at all was a bit of an experiment. But quite a lot has come out of these, actually. So for instance, our mountain biking salon eventually led to the formation of a trails team. And then we also eventually created a region-wide trails map. But we didn't know that that was going to happen in advance. We had to just invite people into the room, see what happens, be patient while people are working stuff out. And then as ideas come up, is it possible to move those forward, and all that kind of thing. So, you know, there are some examples of this kind of way that you can work with this sort of complex idea. But also, again, I just want to emphasize that one of the reasons I'm talking about this is that it's just about recognizing it in the same way that it is about recognizing the feedback and the connectedness generally, is that if we start to recognize that this is the way stuff works, that we can see this kind of interconnectedness, that there's a certain amount of patience and the ability to listen and all that kind of stuff that will just come naturally. It's a little bit different than when we expect things to operate in a different way. So that's what I want to say about complexity. Again, there's a lot more to it. It's a huge field full of smart people doing amazing science and math and so on. But for our purposes, just understanding this basic idea that the interaction of parts of a system can give rise to a new level of order, and also that those systems can't be perfectly controlled. and that what we bring to it is very meaningful. And then also that we can understand the sort of iterative experimenting approach. Those things I think are the good things to remember. And again, as we move forward, I think you'll see resonance, as we talk about networks more and as we talk about the essential skills, the personal behaviors, and so on. So, if you're asking, how do I use these ideas, which, fair. One of the things about all the things I've talked about so far, in addition to what I've already said about it, is that they're about making sense of the world, understanding how it works, seeing interconnectedness and so on. It's interconnectedness is already the case, but we don't always notice it. So seeing that, helps you see the landscape, that's interconnected, and that your organizations are interconnected, and that your behavior is meaningful, all that, whether you're intentional about it or not. And of course, the case I'm making is that being intentional about it is better. And so hopefully this will become evident as we go along. But I'm curious to hear what you all have been thinking about this, since, as I have acknowledged, it's a bit abstract to start out with, but I think it's an important foundation. So what I'd like to ask for you to do now is we're going to put you in groups of 3. And we're just going to take 5 minutes. And what I'd like you to do is answer the question, how might these ideas affect how you work with others? And then we'll come back and hear from a few of you what you had to say. So the question is, how might these ideas affect how you work with others? So for those who are new to doing breakout groups in Zoom, I'm presuming most of you have done them. But we're going to put you in the group, so you're just going to end up in a group. And then you'll get a notice that it'll be a little countdown to when you're going to end up back in the larger group. Yeah? So Devin, if you wouldn't mind putting everyone in groups. One last time, the question is, how might these ideas affect how you work with others? Thanks everyone for participating in those breakout groups. I hope you had a good conversation, and I'm really curious to hear from a few of you what you talked about. I wonder if I can just pick on someone to start. I wonder if Amy Kaiser, if you'd be willing to say what you talked about.
Sure. Yeah, we talked a little bit about. So I'm Amy Kaiser. I work at the San Mateo Resource Conservation District. So we don't own any land. So it's a necessity to work collaboratively for all of our work, either with individual landowners or large organizations for any of our projects. So we're familiar with that, but we can always do better. And I think that there was a conversation going on, about this fail safe or fail small. And I think that that's a really fantastic way to get some small things off the ground or things that seem scary. If you just go for it, I think that really helps. And then we talked too about ways to collaborate internally with our own teams at different levels of organization as well, to be kind of more transparent within the organization.
Great, fantastic, thank you. What about Allison Jolly?
Hi. Our group definitely was, we could have used more time, but we talked about trust and clarity of vision and how all of that relates to time and place of maybe shelter in place, whatever you want to call this current phase we're in. I know I'm not probably capturing what Victor said, so I might want to, but we had a good, quick conversation.
Good, thanks. How about Dina Robertson? What did you guys talk about?
Oh, I was in the group with Amy, so I think she covered it. But I did like the starting out small idea, because I work for the East Bay Regional Park District, and I'm a manager, but there's lots of layers above me, and I'm trying to get a policy passed, but it's very difficult, big ask, big pull. And I'm realizing from this conversation that there are other things I could try that are smaller that could just help us to go and see how it goes and learn from it and just be okay for the things that probably won't work, but there will be some things that will work from it. So.
Right. What about Armando Quintero?
I apologize. I stepped away during the breakout room. So.
Oh my God, Armando, I can't believe it. How about Victor?
Unmuting here. I was with Allison and was it Susan? Anyway, Suzanne. So some of the collaborative work, it really, you know, when you talk about trust and when you go into a collaboration, we come with our worldviews, and some of these things are bound in agency and lots of policy and other stuff. So I think that we come to these organizations and, you know, around whatever that goal is, and we have to be experts of our own world and our culture. And then we give up power and we talk about what it is we want to do and how we go about that. And we have to deal with lots of other agencies and regulators and funders and grant administrators and lots of other stuff. But it really comes into it with what is that vision and what is those common goals. And there are lots of complexities and lots of, you know, getting down into the weeds with stuff. But you have folks and you trust folks and you let folks develop different aspects of it. And as you're, you know, when you talk about those, Dylan, when you were talking about those systems and you set a rule, they kind of fall into place. And then how do you have sets of those that are then interacting? And you have different goals and folks that you need approval from and support from. You try and bring them in, and you may have something that's so audacious, they're going, that's too big, you know, and they go back to what is comfortable, but still bringing them along. And I think it's really, there's a sense of synergy when you start to get movement around stuff. And then you do kind of, you pull folks along with it and you get more excitement built into it. And then people start coming up with those individual solutions for, you know, what one outfit couldn't do, but collaborative you can do together. It is an organism, and it's an organism with lots of different brains. That kind of, just like your crosswalks, things start to going away and you start to see some of those patterns. And for leadership for that stuff, you have to allow people to do what they need to do. And there's going to be failures, there's going to be learning, but that's okay.
Thanks, Victor. I'd love to actually listen to hear what everyone said in the, you know, for time, I'll keep moving forward, but I appreciate everyone having those conversations. We're going to talk for just a few minutes about networks specifically now. So we've left the worldview section, and we're going to talk about networks. I'm going to share my screen here. And so everyone can see the screen? I'm just going to imagine. All right. So we're going to talk about social impact networks and why do we care about networks? And the reason is because networks can do a new kind of work. They can do work that individuals and organizations often can't. Some work has to happen across multiple organizations. And social impact networks are an incredible structure to do that work, an incredible structure for collaboration. It's a way for multiple organizations to work together in an ongoing way. And it's really tailor-made for landscape stewardship. It's clearly a way to think about landscape stewardship as the big picture, the whole system, right? Rather than just thinking about one property or one jurisdiction. And it's a way to think about the ecosystem, so to speak, of organizations that work with the landscape. A really important thing to remember about networks that people often don't know they're forgetting is that networks are not an organization. Networks, or organizations rather, typically have some kind of director or superintendent, and there's usually some kind of command and control structure, maybe a strategic plan that can organize everybody's work, have everybody rowing in the same direction and so on. But a network's not like that. A network is made up of different organizations and individuals and so on. And therefore, it's made up of peers. And so even if there is a network manager or coordinator, that person's not in charge, or at least not in the same way that an executive director or superintendent would be. A network manager can't tell all those organizations what to do. You know, nobody works for the network manager. Instead, frequently, networks are peer generated, you know, the direction that a network takes. The members of the network decide what it should do. They interact through conversation and discover what is of mutual interest, which is a messier process than people are used to. And this process leads to what I call complex purpose. Any collaborative effort has to have some kind of shared purpose, otherwise why are you working together? But I think that often people are thinking too narrowly about that shared purpose. Some models of collaboration talk about you figuring out exactly what you're going to do before you start working together. Or maybe, you know, people are talking about coming up with a strategic plan or something like that. But often neither of those things is possible. And what's good about networks is that as a structure for collaboration, you can actually start with a pretty high level, broad purpose and work from there. So the California Landscape Stewardship Network essentially has as its purpose to increase landscape stewardship in the state of California. But people can participate in the network without everyone agreeing what that means, how it's going to be done, when it's going to happen, who's going to pay for it, and so on. Instead, through interaction, the people in the network can discover more action level purposes over time. Conversation can lead to ideas, and the network members can self-select into groups or into projects to realize those ideas. And in that way, we can move forward as a network without everybody having to agree on everything. You know, in a network, some projects then will be big, some small. They'll happen over different timescales, and there will be different overlapping clusters of people participating in each project. So all of that is complex, right? All those things that are emerging out of all these interactions. It is, in fact, a complex, emergent process, just like the pedestrians or the bird flocking. You know, through our interactions, a new level of order arises in the form of new projects or stronger web of relationships throughout the state, and hopefully, ultimately, you know, better and more stewardship of the land. But, you know, as I was saying before, participating in that really requires some collaborative skill on your part. Tolerance for ambiguity, listening to each other, humility, not presuming your point of view is the only right one, patience, and so on. So if this is a complex emergent process, which it is, then just as in the examples of the cellular automata and autocatalysis and so on, the way we interact is really important. And so I've talked about sort of the essential skills, et cetera, but also another aspect of the way we interact is structure. And so these are three different kind of structures, three architectures for networks. And these could be applied not just to social impact networks, but really to any kind of network. It could be an electrical grid or highways or whatever. And these are just three of the simpler kind of ones, but they help us understand that different structures create different kinds of network function or behavior. So if we look on the left here at the centralized network, you can see that there's a center hub and then there's nodes out on the periphery. And this can be really efficient, that, you know, communicating from, it's just one step from the center hub to everybody else. On the other hand, all the ones on the periphery aren't connected to each other. So you're missing some generativity there. Like they're not connecting and making new things up and that kind of stuff. This network is also vulnerable. You get rid of the center hub and then boom, there's no network. But this could just be one aspect of a network. For instance, in the California Landscape Stewardship Network, the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy acts as the backbone organization. So they're providing a lot of the organization and the communication and so on. So if we looked at this as just the communication, that's great. We want that kind of efficiency there. If we look at the middle image, the decentralized network, we can see different clusters that are connected to each other, but that are also lightly connected to the other clusters. And that could represent the way that different teams or projects are working within the network, where there's some people who are working a little bit more closely, but they're also connected to the rest of the network. On the right, there's a dispersed network. It looks like a highway map. And this is great because everybody's connected to everyone else. On the other hand, if you're trying to get from Los Angeles to New York, you got to go through Reno and Lincoln, Nebraska, and so on and so on. Like, you can't just go in one fell swoop, right? And in any case, if we're talking about everyone being connected, it might not look like that in the kind of networks we're concerned with. It might look a little bit more like this. This is an image from June Holly's book, Network Weaving. And she calls this a smart network because you can see the thicket of connection. There's a core there of people who are working on whatever the issue is. And then there's also a bunch of people on the periphery. And what can be good about that is you have the core that's working on the issues day to day, but then the people on the periphery might bring in new ideas and new resources and so on, because the people in the core haven't already heard their ideas, possibly. This image is maybe a little bit more metaphorical. You can see every node here is connected to every other node. And there's a great pattern then that arises from that. And this could, be an image that kind of is a metaphor for the patterns that arise when we're all connected, all working together. One thing I want to emphasize about structure is relationships are the structure. They are the structural element in a network. They're the links. They're the mortar that hold the bricks together. So in this image, we can see on the left, there's a network that's intact. Everyone in that network is relating to each other. They trust each other and so on. But the image on the right, we can see that there's some kind of relationship going on between the top 3 nodes and also the bottom 2 nodes, but there's no relationship between the 2 groups. So maybe they're factions. Maybe there's not trust between those 2 groups. And then what we can see here then is that if there's not trust there, there's no structure that connects everybody. So trust is allows for the structure that allows the network to function, which is why so many people, when they do networks as a structure for collaboration, work so much on trust so that everyone can very comfortably work with one another. So there is connectivity so that the network can actually function. So, if we're talking about networks as a complex system, then we know that we don't know what's going to happen in advance. But just like when we talked about the qualities of the chemical molecules or the rules for cellular automata or whatever, what we can do is talk about what we start with. We can create the conditions for the network to function well. I mean, that basically is what a network is the effort to create those conditions by which collaboration happens. So it's getting, this is what Sean started off talking about in the very beginning, it's getting all the right players into the room, focusing on relationship building, on trust, trying to get the right information shared and so on. If you get all that happening, something good is gonna happen. You don't necessarily know what it's gonna be in advance, but you know that some good stuff's gonna come out of that. So that's one level of creating the conditions, but there's a lot of other things you can think about too. So where's your network meeting? Are you meeting in Lake Tahoe at a nice hotel with some good food? Or are you meeting in a basement with fluorescent lights and stale coffee? That's really gonna affect what comes out of your network. For one thing, it's gonna affect who's attracted to coming to it, how many people might show up and so on. So there are a lot of different things that we might think of when we talk about creating the conditions. And while a network manager might be in charge of some of those things, it's also what quality are you bringing, as I mentioned before. because that's going to dictate what comes about as well. And so one way to do that is to very intentionally practice with good network practices to help things move along. One way to describe, one way of doing this is complex reciprocity. And this describes the dynamic in which one network member helps another, but doesn't expect something in return. There's not exactly a quid pro quo, because one network member helps another, but then another time, another network member helps yet another one, and so on and so on. And ultimately, everyone is helped, but you're not necessarily tracking it. It's, too many people helping too many people. You can't track it exactly. It's complex. But for that to happen, everyone has to feel like they trust each other. Everyone has to feel like it's okay for them to be generous. And so you can intentionally engage this kind of idea of trying to be generous right away, trying to help each other, trying to look for those opportunities to create this, yeah? Another way to do this is called closing triangles. And this is just basically the idea that, and you probably already do this, but it's just a nice thing to amplify when we're talking about networks, and which is just that if you know two people who should meet each other, you should introduce them. If their work can complement each other, if there's something helpful that can come out of them meeting, if they're talking about something that is resonant with something someone else is talking about, just introduce them. And so you then are creating connectivity by which the network can function more this way. So if you think about it that way, then it's not just a nice thing that you do every once in a while. This is you helping the network be more functional by intentionally doing this. And of course, you don't need a formal network to do this. You can do this anytime. Doing this work, any of these things, outside of a formal network is sometimes referred to as network weaving, because formal networks are great, but a lot of this you can achieve in other ways. This kind of network weaving is what's happening in Minneapolis right now. I'm from Minneapolis. I've been paying very close attention to what's happening in the aftermath of the protests around George Floyd and police brutality. And Facebook has actually been a kind of amazing tool in this case, where I'm able to watch what my friends are up to. And there's this amazing amount of activity where people are forming block groups and neighborhood groups and mutual aid societies. And people are engaging with nonprofits with renewed vigor. There are armies of volunteers coming out to sweep up the glass and distribute food and so on. And all of these things are interacting in various ways. So in other words, there's this epic amount of network weaving happening that's happening a lot of it, but still somehow on a community scale. So this is quite amazing, I think, and just a good example of how this can work. So I'm gonna leave you then with this quote from Peter Reason. He says, "To heal means to make whole. We can only understand our world as whole if we are a part of it. As soon as we attempt to stand outside, we divide and separate. In contrast, making whole necessarily implies participation. One characteristic of a participative worldview is that the individual person is restored to the circle of community, and the human community to the context of the wider natural world. To make whole also means to make holy. Another characteristic of a participatory worldview is that meaning and mystery are restored to human experience so that the world is once again experienced as a sacred place." With that, I am going to hand it over to Chandni Navalka from the Lincoln Land Institute, who is going to talk about the network that she runs as a nice concrete example of a network. So Chandni, please take it away.
Thanks, Dylan, and thanks especially for that amazing quote that you ended with. It's just really nice to set the stage for the work that we do in collaboration and partnership and in networks with that idea that I think all of us feel very close to, of healing and closing that circle. So I'm gonna try to share my screen. Let me know if you can see this. Can everybody see my slides? And I'll just start at the beginning. And I'm gonna actually turn my video off so my computer doesn't overheat. But my name is Chandina Volka. I am the program manager, as Dylan mentioned, for the International Land Conservation Network, which is a project of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I'm gonna share with you some of the work that we do at the Lincoln Institute and how it's related to what Dylan has discussed over the past few minutes. So the International Land Conservation Network was really born out of three goals. The first, to connect practitioners and organizations around the world, so at a global scale, who are working specifically on private land conservation and privately protected area efforts. Our second goal was to bring existing regional and national networks to the international arena. So really to act as a dispersed network or a network of networks. And lastly, our goal was to spur the creation of new networks for voluntary land conservation in places where these networks are nascent or informal or not yet in existence. And our focus on networks is really grounded in the idea that Dylan has touched on, which is that forging peer-to-peer connections between practitioners from across sectors, whether it's the private sector or academic institutions, nonprofits, government agencies, and the public sector, forging those peer-to-peer connections can really lead to leveraging global expertise and creating a trusted community that is willing and able to share ideas and resources. And ultimately, that sharing of ideas and resources will build capacity for innovation and advancement of land conservation efforts on the ground. So the ILCN, which is what we call the International Land Conservation Network, includes several network partners who are leading large landscape conservation initiatives in countries around the world. And some of those people who have been involved are on this call today, including Sharon and Sean and Devin. And kind of to test or experiment, as we talked about earlier in this call, whether international peer learning could help to advance these initiatives. In 2018, we brought together teams of leaders from across sectors involved in large landscape conservation efforts in two countries, the United States and Chile. So we started our international networking with just two countries as our experiment. And we were really only able to do this because of relationships that had been forged loosely or strongly through the network over time. So, actually over 3 decades. And those relationships then led to new relationships that allowed this group of really extraordinary individuals, some of whom are represented in this picture and some of whom aren't, to come together. And reflecting just the complexity of working at the landscape scale and the international scale, team members who participated in this exchange came from very different organizations, including the National Park Service in the US, a private law firm, NGOs, foundations, a global forest products manufacturer, and others. So they really represented sets of relationships on the ground, focused to some degree on the same initiative and with similar goals, but not necessarily people who are already working together in coordination or in focused collaboration. So our idea was really that bringing this group together to visit each other's landscapes, not to be in dark basement rooms and with fluorescent lights, but to be out in the field looking at wild places and places of high conservation value together with their peers, would really allow the group to strategize together about how to solve the challenges of landscape scale conservation and collaboration, and build upon and activate interconnections and relationships and trust. But really, we had no idea, so kind of going back to this idea of setting the stage, but not really knowing what will come and being open to the emergent, is that we had no idea where these conversations would lead to, or if they would lead anywhere. even as we knew that there was, you know, a deliverable in the sense of each team would produce a document that would reflect their landscape and strategy. But other than that, we really didn't know what would come out of this exchange. So on this slide, I just wanted to show kind of the range of landscapes and pictures of where we were. But what were the outcomes? The opportunity to spend some time together, taking a step back from a project or an organization or a landscape for each of the people involved was extremely generative. You know, in California, rather than focusing on the challenges of the particular landscape, the conversation focused on advancing systems change at the statewide level to truly enable cross-jurisdictional and regional landscape scale work. And in Chile, the team members from that team really shifted the terms of their understanding in thinking about their landscape and the kinds of change they needed to push forward as systemic change at the national level and at the public level in Chile. So really, I just wanted to highlight that this peer exchange represents a few elements that I think show how working in a networked way is unique and extremely powerful. And the first is that there was a balance between the planned and the spontaneous. So the core staff of the ILCN served as kind of the hub and tried to steer us in gentle ways, but really we left plenty of room for spontaneous interaction to allow both the hub and the spokes to adapt to what emerged out of the group. And people were able to move in and out of the exchange, people and organizations, I should say, were really able to move in and out of the exchange as they needed. We had a couple of people participate in Chile who weren't able to participate in the rest of the exchange, but their participation with us was still extremely generative, and in certain ways they continue to be involved, and their team continues to receive support from other exchange members. And I think that, you know, letting people give what they were willing to allowed us to adjust without losing the momentum or intentionality of the exchange, which was to kind of foster a sense of international community and a community of practice around this topic. And then lastly, I just wanted to share that I think the network allowed for a diversity of perspectives and a diversity of personalities that sparked new thinking, which is, I think, a really important part of networks is just the diversity of the people involved and how that leads to emergence and adaptation. So that's really what I wanted to share about the peer exchange that the ILCN led. And if you have questions or if I can speak to any of those elements further, feel free to put them in the chat box.
Thanks, Johnny. That's fantastic. It's such a cool network. Thanks for sharing it with us. If you do have questions, put those in the chat box for Chandi. And I think what we'll do now, though, is we're going to take, oh, maybe there are some questions coming up. Hold on. All right, here, what we're going to do is we're going to take a 10-minute break. So everyone has the chance to get a snack and do whatever else you need to do. If there are questions that you have for Chandi, you can put those in the chat in the meantime. And if there are enough there, we can start with that. But otherwise, we'll start back with Sean Johnson presenting when we come back. So it's 2:48 now. So come back at 2:58. We're going to be pretty exact about the timing since we don't have to chase everyone down from the snack table or whatever since we're on Zoom. So we'll see you in exactly 10 minutes.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice break. It was great to have that countdown clock. So thank you, Michaela, for sharing that. I don't know about you guys, but every time I listen to Dylan talk, and maybe this is the first time that you have, it just fills my head with so many insights and ideas and starts spinning all over the place. And it was great to have those grounded examples from Yakuta and Chandi. And so one of the things that I did during my break is I called to mind this slide that I'd seen, this quote that I'd seen from Tony Hiss. So before I jump in with my comments, I just wanted to share this because I thought it was so spot on with the kind of feeling that I'm having right now about making sense of this moment. And it's this quote that was at the heels of a conversation about landscape conservation. So I feel like it's especially appropriate for this. But really at the end of that, we were all filled with ideas, and Tony really framed it well. He said, what is next? You know, we all might take some time to assimilate the ascendancy of a new insight, a permanent expansion in the perception of landscapes, you know, thinking at that scale, at that level of complexity. It's not about this NIMBYism of the past, not my backyard or someone else's. There's only one backyard, and it's our care and delight, our inheritance and our responsibility. When you gain that new capacity, where will you set your sights? If someone gives you a telescope, what will you look at first? And so that's what I'm thinking. I've got all these virtual telescopes now into the world that we work in that Dylan's just shared with us. And I'm trying to think about, what will I look at first? What will I look at next? For this next bit here, we've got about an hour of time left together. We've got 3 more presenters. We're all going to be relatively brief, and we're going to leave some time for you at the end as well. But we want to really drill down into this layer that is at the heart of what Dylan's been talking about, which is an essential skill set that's really built off of a couple of things. One, fostering these connections, these relationships, the interconnections between the nodes. But not just those interpersonal connections between 2 nodes, really thinking about what that looks like at the systems or at the network scale, and building a collaborative culture that embodies the kind of spirit and care that we want within our organizations, within our networks, within the systems that we work. So I want to start by revisiting a slide from Dylan. And he shared this with us early on. You may remember this one single dot on the map. And thinking that, you know, often we think we work in isolation, but we don't. We're connected to others. We are a part. There are other parts, and we're connected by interconnections. And the structure is really a result of the function or purpose that we share together. And that function or purpose could be something as similar as, or as simple as our family organization. It could be our workplace. It could be our ultimate Frisbee club, but it's something that holds us together. I want to suggest for this next part just a simple tweak, and that's that we change the word parts to people, and that we really think about the relationships and the relational elements of this work, because it really is the relationships that hold us together. And as I was preparing some images for today, I came across this one, which really to me brings this idea of people being networks to life. This is just a representation of all the nodes and all the ways that we're connected and stretched. And what I see here is, you know, not just a nice tapestry of people woven together into some sort of beautiful image, but I also see people that are not connected to each other, and yet the image itself still stands. And so I think as we think about not just relationships and essential skills around fostering and building relationships and trust, but thinking more about the culture and the collaborative nature of our work, that we do really need to zoom out and think about those parts. Think about the individual capacities and assets that each of us are bringing. And when we do that, moving back to a more simplified image here, we start to see some specific roles and actions that different people play. And so this is obviously very simplified, but you'll see within the blue grouping there on the upper left, a central connector role, that person in the middle that's connected to everyone else within that subnetwork or within that organization. You'll see a lot of gateway actors, people who connect one organization or one network to another. And then you'll see some people playing very specific roles. You might have a peripheral actor like we have here, who's a member, a tangential member of a network, the kind of pinkish color there in the center of my screen. At the bottom, I'm showing a little bit of directionality just to represent that each of these nodes, each of these people, they have their own personality and their own role. So you may have someone that's really good at receiving information, but not sharing information back. And that becomes a silent actor within that network or within that organization. So the key point here is to think about the diversity of roles and perspectives that we have within our organizations, within and across our networks, and how each of those contribute to an image of what our entire system looks like. One of the things that we focus a lot on are the connections between a couple of people in our role in those. And Dylan did a nice job just framing this as closing triangles in his last section, or that last session of our presentation, where he said, you know, if you know two people and you think they should know each other, introduce them to each other. That's a good way to build your network and build collaborative capacity. The more complicated story is that if you know person A and B, there's a number of different roles you can play. And the linchpin of what Dylan said is, if you think they should know each other, if you think there's value in them getting to know each other, that may be good, but maybe that's not the case. So you really do need to think about how those people interact and connect and what your role is in connecting them. So this is just a nice demonstration of the variety of roles that you can play in facilitating, fostering, or hindering a connection between two individuals. You could certainly be a liaison or coordinator between them. You could also be a gatekeeper of information. So keeping that piece in mind, I think, is just as important. But I do want to zoom back out to thinking about, well, what is it that we're trying to do as we both build essential skills around relationship and around collaborative culture? And I want to suggest that there are three key things that we're doing as we think about the skill set around that. That it's really about an opportunity to build and share information, collective knowledge, both across people and across an organization or within a network. There's the interpersonal element of fostering trust and connectivity. And then there's the collaborative piece of engaging in a shared process, the challenges of facilitating and negotiating in a multi-party context. And I think just to flip this on its head for a minute, I am a co-chair of a program in natural resources conflict resolution, and it's these same elements that are often at the heart of tension and conflict among individuals, right? That we don't share information, or that we have conflicting information or different science, that we don't trust one another, or that we've broken trust in the past and we don't have that connectivity. And that could be around some of the power dynamics that we talked about earlier, or that we don't have a skill set that enables us or equips us to engage in shared process. And that could be because of a collaborative skill set, but it could also be because some of the institutional barriers or cultural norms that we possess, that it's just not part of who we are, how we've worked. So I really do want to think about these both in what they are and how we can facilitate and foster them, but also recognize that they often exist as barriers to our work. And so it really is about a deliberative process of working through which of these to build and how and when. We also know, based on our opening exercise, that it's not necessarily just as simple as those three pieces, right? When you're thinking about the connections between individuals and across, there's a lot that goes into a collaborative skill set working together at the landscape scale. So here's just a quick snapshot of that word cloud from earlier this afternoon. I want to just take a section or a minute here to do two things. One, put this into the context of saying, okay, well, what does this mean for collaborative leadership and for the quote unquote essential skills around relationship development and cultural cohesion and collaboration, and then move into an example of what that looks like in some of the work that I've done. And I think the way to really explain this is to talk about what it is that a collaborative leader does. And it's not necessarily just that positional person, that person that coordinates or sends the emails around or anything like that. It's everyone within the network. And it's around, several things, and there are different lists from different people. I just want to share a few insights from one of the lists that I've assembled over the years. And part of it we talked about earlier. It's about looking at Yakuta's example, for example. What worked really well for them was having a set of group norms and being able to establish those for your communications and for the way you treat each other, right? So thinking about what does it take to do that. Part of that is the process that you're engaged in and having a skill set and an approach where everyone is heard and everyone's voice matters. And so making sure that that is an inclusive and participatory environment. There's also a sense of authenticity in these, that these are really whole and rich and meaningful connections. These aren't built on traditional power dynamics, but they're really built on culture and purpose and identity and connection. With that, there is a need, and this is something that's often looked, to mediate and understand conflicts and disputes. So this isn't, and I think all of us that are engaged in collaborative problem solving know that this isn't about kumbaya moments. This is really tough work. And one of the favorite lines I've heard about this over the years is that, collaboration's not that hard. It's not rocket science. And the punchline is, of course, that it's not rocket science. It's much more difficult than that. And I think that really resonates with me at times. At the same time, you need to have as you're engaging with people in this participatory process, you want to think about the different mechanisms to solicit ideas, to problem solve, to build shared identity, to do things together. And we've talked about a lot of those. Instead of going through a list and unpacking those in the abstract, I want to ground that in an example that really resonates with me. And what I often do in my work, when I'm thinking about the different elements of it, I always come back to kind of three things that I'm trying to do in addition to the collaborative problem solving. I think it's more around the collaborative culture piece, and that's connect, and I think we talk a lot about connections, equip and empower people, so make sure that they have the skill sets, the knowledge, the ability to do the work, and inspire. And for me, I think we often forget about trying to inspire people by leveraging our time, our talents, our abilities around the places we care about and the things we care about. So this is a quick image of a landscape that's near and dear to my heart. This is Glacier Park in the crown of the continent of Montana. And I want to just take a minute to pause from a screen share of PowerPoint slides and show a quick video from a partner who captures this landscape in a way that brings us closer to it, and I think brings us closer together as people who care about it. All right, so thanks for allowing me to share that with you all. I feel so connected to that landscape, and it inspires me every time I see images and see people enjoying it and see the wildlife and the rushing water and all of those things that are so much a part of that community. Want to make sure I find the right screen share here as I go back to my slides. All right, so hopefully you guys are back there. Devin, let me know if I'm not where I want to be. The other thing about this landscape is obviously that it's like all of our landscapes. It inspires us. It connects us to it. We find inspiration there, but there's also challenges there. And so I just want to talk about the story of some of the challenges that we faced and how we've used an essential skill set and a collaborative culture to address those. So this is an image of that landscape, a map without boundaries here. If you can see my cursor there, that is the US-Alberta, US-Canada border. And this is an 18 million acre ecosystem that spans the Northern Rockies in Montana and Southern BC and Alberta. It's a complex jurisdiction. And so I just wanted to highlight for you some of the jurisdictions and the complexity that we face across that landscape here. Looking at not just First Nation and tribal lands, but the national parks, other federal agencies, provincial agencies, state trusts, and others. We've got a lot of private land as well at the periphery, even though the core really is largely protected public land. So we were facing jurisdictional complexity, and then we were also just facing a lot of the same challenges that all of you are facing as they relate to water resources, land fragmentation, habitat, wildlife connectivity, empowering our communities to survive in a changing economy. And that in large part relied on effective and efficient, or not effective and efficient alone, but really innovative tourism models to bring people in a way that was sustainable and connected them to culture and place. And then we do have two, on the US side, we have 2 Indian reservations, and on the Canadian side, we've got 7 more First Nations that are part of this landscape and call it home. And so we're really thinking about how do we integrate all those things together. And we weren't coming into it blindly. We were like, oh, there's models out there we can follow, and let's think about what those models can tell us and think about how to apply them. And so there's this systems leadership model here that includes the system that we talked about earlier, the complex insights that you get from that. There's the community element, and whether you think about that in terms of advocacy as this model depicts, or if you just think about that as trying to make sure that you achieve some certain outcomes on behalf of constituencies, think about it whatever way that resonates with you. And then there are the individual elements, those pieces where we're looking at connections to bridge the gaps across those and really think about the systems leadership that's involved. And that's really often this collaborative leadership skill set. We also, within this landscape, took a step back and said, you know what, we've got a lot of the right conditions here. We've got a lot of existing relationships we can build on. We've got some effective leadership. We've got really compelling possibilities in this iconic landscape. We've got some competition right now across interests, and we're wondering if maybe there's some new and innovative ways to connect those so that it's more cooperation and collaboration instead of competition. We've got this interest and this willingness to learn as we go. And people had some sort of shared identity and shared purpose. And it was largely around this idea that we were all connected to this landscape and not connected to each other around some of these key challenges and opportunities. And those were real opportunities for us to explore. We had enough of a working governance and decision-making structure in place, and just really the sense that we can do more than we could do together. It didn't hurt that we're in an iconic landscape that has national and international recognition, but honestly, that was not at the forefront of our mind. It wasn't something that was really driving us, but we did see it as an asset as we move forward. I'm gonna drill down, one layer deeper here into, well, what specifically could we do to advance our thinking in the context of on-the-ground conservation and stewardship work? And so we were able to pull together a group of people from across the region to apply for some funding. ended up funding this initiative called the Adaptive Management Initiative. And we're really looking at it as an opportunity to think about change within our community and the dynamism that we were facing, and the way to use our connections to interface with those changes in a way that could really impact our communities, affect our landscapes, and really honor our values. And so we came up with this approach that was really focused on affirming our vision, our values, and our principles, that included the cultural elements that we cared about. It was really a look both back and forward. So what have we done historically that's worked? Where can we look moving forward? A little bit of a gap analysis. It was really thinking about the connections, that constituency, who needs to be a part of this, and then how do we connect that to on the ground change and action, showcasing different models and the learning across those. And so what I want to do here is focus on the relationship elements of this. Even though we were really focused on some on the ground impacts around adaptation for habitat, for communities, for landscapes, for water resources, we at the same time were building a community and building relationships. We did that by pulling together, and I think what I want to focus back on were those enabling conditions. We created and fostered an enabling conversation where we were bringing people together. We didn't necessarily have clear direction for how they would come together, but we brought them together around key themes and resources and just fostered a learning environment. And we recorded that over time. And so in the first year of 2013 was the first year of the Adaptive Management Initiative. That was AMI. So again, this is a subset of our larger coalition, but there were 12 organizations at the beginning who were bringing together in a dedicated forum to foster connections, both to build collaborative capacity as well as personal relationships. After a year, we went from what you can see here was 12 organizations and 32 ties among those organizations to 20 organizations and 116 ties among those organizations. So not only were there more organizations involved, but the ties between those organizations grew really significantly between the first and second year. That growth continued into a third year where 24 organizations became involved. The number of ties was at 195. And so this was a 3-year initiative that we tracked over time. And we thought, well, that'll be really interesting. I wonder what happens when our kind of self-organization, or not our self-organization, but our deliberate organization stops and self-organization continues. And so Patrick Bixler at the University of Texas now was doing this social network analysis for us. And we said, hey, Patrick, go back in 2016 and take another look. And you'll see that it didn't change much. We had been able to build collaborative capacity and build networks that endured. The number of organizations stayed consistent from 2015 to 2016 at 24, and the number of ties actually increased from 195 to 232. So some really, I think, interesting things happened throughout that because of our approach of applying those collaborative skill set in the context of our region and the needs of the region around some of the adaptive capacity they were trying to build. So what do we want to reflect on and learn from all of that? Well, there are a couple of things I want to share with you before turning it over to Devin here. The first is a personal reflection and learning. I used to think that this work was about what you're seeing on the picture here, which is a mismatch. I used to just think, you know what, we just didn't have the right tool for our need. If we just could figure out how to have the right model to respond to this challenge, we'd have the answer that we need and we could problem solve and move forward. And as you all know, it's not as simple as that. The things that we're working in, the complex environments that we're working in, we don't have that level of control, as Dylan was demonstrating earlier. What we do have is an ability to affect or interact within a dynamic network system. So it looks more like this, and this was an image that Lynn Scarlett created for the Roundtable on the Crown of the Continent way back in 2010 that I keep going back to, saying that it's these systems and the way they're connected and interconnected and reconnected and rewoven around specific purposes and different purposes, which can be complex and many, within the context of a landscape, that we're actually getting the work done. And so think about the dynamism that's involved in this around not just a specific project, but over time, and then the relationships that are embedded within all of that. So why are we talking about all of this? Well, it's because social networks and collaborative stewardship really go hand in hand. There's a lot that's embedded within a social network that really equips and empowers us to be successful. The first is that social networks tie us as either individuals or organizations to institutions that span and link those multiple jurisdictions and scales that we all need to work at. So thinking back to that map I showed earlier, it really gave us a new ability to think at that scale by having those connections. It also increased our capacity by increasing and building social memory and social capital that we could rely on over time and go back to, even after we were finished with our more focused project work. It's really important if you're going to mobilize and grow support, whether that's legal, political, or financial. And it's really great at helping identify knowledge gaps as well as filling those if you need them. The last 2 points, though, I think for me are the most important, is that you're building ongoing and adaptive capacity that leads to social learning. And because we exist within these complex dynamic systems, if we're not learning, then we're not actually meeting the moment. And we're always a little bit behind, which we are as a species anyway. But thinking about how can we keep up with our needs and the challenges and the opportunities that we're facing, these connections help us do that. We just need to be very deliberate about them and make sure that they're connected to those core purpose areas. Thankfully, we've had people like the California Network and the One TAM initiative in particular help us think about, well, what are all the individual things that I should be building that help me build both the relationship and the culture that I need to be effective in this space. And so this is a nice depiction of that from a slide that Sharon shared with me earlier around some of the work that One TAM has done. And if you think about, well, what do I need as an individual? It's awareness at all these different levels, and it's some specific skill set. And I think about it in the context of a skill set that helps you engage in process and relationship around facilitation and mediation and negotiation. But it's these different elements too, including emotional intelligence and other things. So I want to return to that slide that I shared at the beginning, but then put in some squiggles on here to show that all of that is existing in a dynamic and evolving context. And then ask Devin to take it from here to unpack each of these strands a little bit more to demonstrate how within each of those there are specific things that we can do that can build our own skill set and collaborative capacity. So Devin, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sean. Let me just get my slides up as well. Has everyone seen that all right as I do my own test? All right.
That's good.
So thanks so much for laying this out, Sean, and I'm looking forward to building off of what you've laid here as a foundation. You know, the three dynamics that Sean's just introduced us to here are playing out on different timelines, but they also occur simultaneously, right? So a number of the skills that we want to build awareness around today will apply to multiple of these. So for instance, some of the skills necessary to build and share information are also involved in how we shape effective processes. And underlying both of those would be the fundamental skills of fostering trust and connectivity in order to keep going on with the other two. And so when we think about how collaborative leadership elements can give rise to effective networks, I often imagine these three threads interweaving to form a stronger bond between those connections. And so just to jump into the first one here, the ways in which people build and share information. So as we've heard throughout this afternoon here, you know, each collaborative initiative is unique in its story. It requires its own structures and process. But the successful collaboratives grow from a connection to and love of a place. So the first question in this work is often, who's doing what where? This is a universal challenge that we see play out in the partnership-based work that we've done. And in this way, building and sharing information begins at the place of identifying who needs an invite to the table, to the group. And so once these partners are identified, you might imagine that the question then becomes, how do we start connecting pieces to make informed decisions about the places that we care for and love? And this question is essential, right? Because we've got institutional and cultural barriers to connecting in meaningful ways, pandemic or not. We might be stuck in information silos. There's a lack of relationships or perhaps a history of contentious relationships, socio-political divisions, and so on. And as we've heard so eloquently from the presenters throughout the day, working at the landscape scale requires seeing this complexity and this interconnectedness. So in a system like the Golden Gate Biosphere, which Shani's already showed earlier today, you've got numerous information holders, each with staggeringly large data sets describing the biophysical and social realities that are changing over time and space. You've got numerous landowners and land managers, each operating under their own mandate. And layered on top of that, you have millions of people living their lives across the landscape, each with their own set of values that drive how they interact with the land, the water, wildlife, and importantly, how they interact with each other. And so a lot of what's essential to building and sharing this information is a willingness to see things new. It's a willingness to see the bigger picture in the ways that Dylan has described. So there's a willingness to accommodate that complexity and to redefine knowledge, expertise, and wisdom by accessing the entirety of the wisdom in the room that you've assembled. And that wisdom may be technical, it may be experiential, it may be non-traditional, but you seek to build a body of information that best captures the reality on the ground. And lastly, you want to be willing to understand and discuss the sources of conflict, right? So amassing the information that is more easily shared across partners is really only as good as the willingness of those partners to work together. So some of the skills that might come to mind that are associated with these essential components of building and sharing information. Well, as you've heard throughout the day, these are really complex landscapes. So the ability to synthesize large amounts of information that's multidisciplinary may not be your field of expertise, but requires a lot of attention and a lot of commitment to thinking about how those threads are interconnected comes to mind. Also, as we've heard from Chandni and others, diversity in these networks is certainly a strength to be celebrated. And so when it comes to the brainstorming and idea generating phase, brainstorming without judgment really brings to life the diversity of perspectives, of interests, and of lived experiences. And lastly, a general skill to build awareness around today that I want to highlight in particular is ways in which we can identify and access partnership knowledge and experience. So what might be an example of ways in which we do build and share information? I want to highlight today the process of joint fact-finding. Now, joint fact-finding is just one way of acknowledging the complexity of the systems that we're working in, the issues that we deal with, by providing a procedure where we can balance the role of science with everything else that we know to matter in environmental decision-making, right? So our values, our politics, our cultural norms. If science could win the day, then we would clearly be making our environmental policy and decision-making solely based on the science, but that is not what we see, as I'm sure everyone in the room knows well. So joint fact-finding is an acknowledgement that these wicked problems can be better addressed by integrating natural and social sciences with some of those experiential and non-traditional forms of knowledge. It's being willing to listen to stakeholder concerns. And it has two or three key elements that reflect back on how partnerships can more effectively build and share information. So joint fact-finding promotes co-designing and co-learning around an issue. So in doing so, it builds a body of information that is both scientifically credible and publicly and socially legitimate. Another important element of joint fact-finding is that it seeks to authentically access local and cultural knowledge. And in doing so, it brings technical expertise into a space where things like science, whether it's natural sciences, social sciences, that scientific inquiry becomes shaped by what's relevant both to the resource and to the community. And to be minimally effective and minimally successful, the literature suggests that joint fact-finding requires several different elements. One, it must be representative, right? So if you know someone is missing that might have information on the issue, or the landscape or the system in which you work, they should be invited to the table. It should be facilitated. In order to work through and synthesize this tremendous amount of information, a professional can be there to design the process, to structure the conversations, to keep everyone involved. So for instance, no one gets to provide their information and then duck out. The scientist and the policymaker who may have fundamentally different pressures and interests acting upon them sit at the table and listen to where they're coming from, and in doing so can begin to address that gap in understanding that may exist between them. And thirdly, it requires commitment and accountability. So the convening organization must take accountability for the decision reached, and the participants should take accountability for their contributions and commitments made from that decision-making process. These are the 6 steps that are highlighted for joint fact-finding. And without getting into too much detail, I want to highlight a few of these steps that strike me as important. You know, and the first is to, as you embark on a collaborative effort, to actually ask yourself whether or not a collaborative approach is even appropriate. Even us parishioners in the Church of Collaboration can acknowledge that some issues are not yet able to be solved successfully in a collaborative framework. But assessing that situation through a stakeholder assessment or a scenario assessment could be a first step to reveal that reality. Secondly, there's a way to create and distribute value on the ground for those involved. This is the space where brainstorming without judgment really comes to life here when you're dealing with a tremendous amount of information and technical knowledge. And thirdly, this idea of follow through is really important. Thinking back to something that actually Michelle said from her breakout group that's related, the idea of following through, of assessing and evaluating how the joint fact-finding venture has gone, and taking an adaptive approach to where it is done iteratively is another marker of successful joint fact-finding. So an interesting case study that comes to mind with joint fact-finding would be the Penobscot River Restoration Project. And so I know what you're thinking. That's the Penobscot River in Maine, all the way from California. Couldn't be even further. And what's Maine got to worry about after all? I mean, they really do have it all. You can start the day off with a great pair of boots in Freeport. And then by the end of the day, if you're really ambitious, you can use the same pair of boots to bag some surf and some turf. But really, Maine does have its challenges too that collaborative conservation can help address. And at the beginning of the workshop, we heard from Dylan that one example of systems interconnectedness is the concept of damming, right? Dams are an example of that interconnectedness, and the Penobscot River is quite a heavily dammed river. It's around 8,500 square miles big. It's the second largest river in New England. And there are a handful, between half a dozen and 9 dams that exist on the north, south, and western branches of this river. And the consequences, intended or not, of this damming system really do reveal the system's complexity. So damming the river potentially impacts fur bearer species that are wetland dependent. They certainly impact waterfowl species, including New England's iconic loon. Migrating fish populations are certainly impacted. But outside of the wildlife, there are also whitewater recreation economies that are impacted by damming, and not least of which the historical issue of impairing access to tribal grounds that infringe on tribal sovereignty. So really, in the Penobscot River, it's just another day in collaborative conservation. As Sean would say, it's certainly not rocket science, it's actually harder. But in response to this, out on the Penobscot, one of the early phases of this project was to build and share information among the key players. And really, in looking at this case study, it follows along with the successful 3 elements that joint fact-finding would urge us to do. So it was representative. It brought along the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy tribes. It brought several state and federal agencies to the table, as well as recreation groups, and of course, hydropower interests, along with environmental nonprofits. And it was facilitated. So with the help of the EPA's Alternative Dispute Resolution Program, people came together to co-create and co-coordinate conduct and implement multiple studies that looked at both the biophysical, economic, and social realities on the ground. And the process, importantly, by having this facilitator, didn't demand that they reach agreement right off the bat. It gave time to build and share information through all group meetings, through cross-party working groups that looked at subsets of this technical data set, and also created space to allow for these parties to see challenges from each other's perspectives without having to prescribe a solution prematurely. And thirdly, its participants met the requirement of taking accountability for the outcome. So in 2004, they signed an agreement that significantly managed to rebalance hydropower and sea-run fisheries on the Penobscot by removing several dams that existed as key barriers, while increasing power generation at 6 existing dams. And the removal happened to free up miles of habitat upriver that now people for cultural, social, recreational interests can enjoy. And we'll revisit the Penobscot in a bit, but for now I want to jump into the second of our 3 dynamics here. And that's the way in which people also engage in shared process. So what comes to mind that's essential in engaging in a shared process? You know, we heard Victor actually reflect on his own breakout earlier today in a way that ties into some of the points I want to make here. What's really essential to engaging in a shared process is creating and holding a shared vision. So seeing the shared vision among a diverse set of participants is key, and it's a challenge. What is the underlying set of motivations in the midst of all this complexity? And how do you keep your eye on that fundamental story in the midst of all that complexity? And engaging in collaborative processes also, you know, it requires a spirit of generosity. So a spirit of generosity in sharing the value you bring to the effort, as well as giving credit to your partners. But there's also a balance that needs to play out, right? That you are there to advance your own work and your own aspirations within the collective as well. And thirdly, something that's essential in engaging in a shared process that would touch on all of these dynamics, quite honestly, is your capacity for emotional intelligence, right? And so looking at your collaborators and recognizing that after all, they're not their position title and affiliation. That is certainly who they are when they come to this work, but they are also whole people that come to the work. They have their bad days. They can be distracted and raggedy on some of them. They may not be the most extroverted person in a field that really relies on social connectivity. And so it's the collaborative leader's task to pick up on these subtleties in personality, whether they're nonverbal cues and body language expressions, and learn to navigate them to everyone's benefit. Now, there are a number of skills to begin to practice when engaging in a shared process, all of which could likely be its own workshop. And for the purposes of today, I really want to highlight one of them that I revisit often. And that's the ability to listen for what different opinions and positions are aimed at, and to shift them from positions to interests. So what do we mean by going from positions to interest? Well, it brings to mind the story of the orange. 2 people want one orange, and they fight and fight over it, each trying to convince the other that they want it more and that they need it more. In the end, one person takes it and the other person gets none, much to their chagrin. And they've spent all this time only saying what they want, demanding it perhaps. They want that orange. But if they had asked each other why they want it, they would have found out that one person wanted the fruit to eat and the other person was looking for the rind to make an orange cake. And so the idea of moving past talking about what we want and expressing our underlying motivations, concerns, our interests for why we want them begins to reveal that fundamental change in how we work together. So if these people had discussed why they want this orange, they might have gotten both of what they wanted. So I want to take a bit of a deeper dive into this idea of positions versus interests. And I'm going to show you a table here and fill it out interactively with you. Where on the left, we've got someone's position, what they want. And on the right is their interest, so why they want it. And as I move through this table and you see the what pop up on the left-hand side, go ahead and in the chat box, offer up some of your thoughts on what the underlying why might be. So things you say you want. I want to go to that restaurant for dinner. And you may argue about going to this restaurant or that restaurant, but why might one want to go to that restaurant for dinner? Yeah, that's right, Kevin, it may have good crayons, which for someone in your position, I'm sure that's awfully important. For some, it might be the best food, eating healthy and locally sourced. It might have a good wine selection. There might be a romantic ambiance, and it might be Friday night after all. Yeah, exactly. Thanks so much for filling in the blanks, everyone. What about things we demand? So clean up your room now. A parent might tell this to their child. What about that parent's underlying values and concerns, instilling a sense of responsibility and the value of cleanliness in their child? This one might be a little more familiar to the workspace. So what about hearing from a collaborator that they will not submit this report until it is truly ready? The underlying why there could simply be that that person is trying to express their standards and aspirations. They may be seeking perfection as a professional, or in another way of thinking about it, they're trying to bring about their professional quality to the highest possible degree. They may be looking to make the most meaningful contribution to the partnership. Kim's point is a good one. There may be fear of being reprimanded if it's not the report that people want to see. And lastly, what about things you say you will or won't do? So here in some of Sean's world with conflict resolution and natural resource issues, what about a collaborator saying, I won't call you or I won't speak to you until I hear an apology from you? And this one doesn't probably take too much emotional intelligence to get through. There are likely underlying feelings and emotions there. That person is hurt or angry. They may be seeking respect and consideration. So in this idea of positions and interests, we can jump on back to the Penobscot River. How might this play out in a collaborative context like the river restoration project there on the Penobscot? Well, there's a need to view that negotiation differently. We enter into negotiations not to win or because it's a zero-sum game, but in order to improve each party's situation beyond what it would be without talking. And our experience in partnership-based work has revealed that those who approach negotiation with this different outlook display more collaborative behaviors that can advance their collective interests and generate that collective impact we're seeking. And like all interactions in partnership, you have to negotiate as if relationships mattered because they do. So here on the Penobscot, that ability to shift from positions to interests really enabled a striking scenario where those different stakeholders and interests had their interests met to a large degree. So we now have a situation with unobstructed or vastly improved access to nearly 1,000 miles of river for native species, whether that's the alewife or the endangered Atlantic salmon. It's revitalized the Penobscot Indian Nation's culture and traditions. And it also continues to enable economic opportunities for those riverside and river-dependent communities. And really what this brings to mind in stepping back from those specific case study is that the collaborative leader approaches the potential for collaboration not as transactional, right? But as creating shared value and looking for ways to distribute that value. So they're not going to sit back and wait for things to appear favorable for them, but they're going to engage with and listen intently to their collaborators. And they do so in order to create more favorable conditions for everyone. So thinking back to what Dylan said a short while ago this afternoon, expressing that humility and doing it first and coming to these interactions and partnership work with that fundamental change in worldview. So thirdly, in our interweaving threads of essential skills, I want to point to the third one here, the ways in which people foster trust and connectivity. And we're going to speak about this dynamic last, but not because it's least, certainly not. We know that relationships are actually key to collaboration and that effective relationships are built on trust. And so to build on this idea further, we have our colleague Amy Mickle here to highlight some of her own research in collaborative partnerships and collective impact. And so with that, I will hand it off to Amy, and she can take it from there.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Devin, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share a little bit about my research. For those of you that don't know me, I am a professor in management at a college of business at Sacramento State University, so it's one of the California state universities. I've been a professor for 20 years. I've also consulted 17 of those 20 years. I've consulted for the state of California on a variety of different projects, including consulting projects for the Department of Parks and Recreation. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some research that I have conducted, and really also trying to talk about some of my findings through the lens of how we can increase trust to build and strengthen collaborative connections. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Hopefully. Okay. Okay, so just again, a little bit of background. I had the fortunate opportunity to research a multi-stakeholder partnership. It was a 4-year longitudinal study of OneTAM, which we've already alluded to. And OneTAM, in its first 4 years, OneTAM is basically focuses on land adjacent to and on Mount Tamalpais, which is north of San Francisco in California. It's a partnership that is comprised of national parks, California state parks, Marin Municipal Water District, Marin County Parks, and backbone agency Golden Gate National Conservancy. Oops. Can you guys hear me? There we go. Okay, good. All right, so out of this research emerged a model, and it's called the Partnership Impact Model. On the figure on the left talks about 11 impacts that OneTAM was able to achieve in their first 4 years, and the image on the right-hand side illustrates that scaling up for impact is a non-linear dynamic process. One of the things that I want to also just tip my hat off to is this research I conducted with Lee Goldberg. It was guided by Sharon Farrell, and it was sponsored by the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation. And so the key elements that we found in this is that connectivity and trust were essential to everything, that they are core to being effective in partnership throughout all phases of a partnership, including startup phase, the building phase, and the maintaining and sustaining phase. And so one of the things that also I would like to highlight is the fact that connectivity and trust, it can be assessed. Sean already noted that you can assess connectivity through things like a social network analysis. And we did find that OneTAM, it actually increased its connectivity by 278% from year 1 to year 4. We also were able to measure trust on an individual level, as well as on among the partners and within the community. And for example, we were able to demonstrate that there was an 80% increase from pre-MOU to year 4. Just want to make sure, I keep seeing chat things come up and want to make sure that I'm not missing something like you can't hear me. All right. Okay, so let's see. So again, just today, I wanted to talk a little bit about trying to put this more in a practitioner's point of view, is that how can we increase trust to build and strengthen collaborative connections? Again, I just want to reiterate, connections and trust are essential to building and strengthening collaborative efforts in a partnership, and it really must be attended to throughout all phases of a partnership's life cycle. To define what I mean by collaborative connections and trust, collaborative connections I define as they're intentionally formed relationships between and among individuals and groups for the purpose of working together on collaborative efforts. Those connections can be internal, including people who are actively involved in a partnership and its work, such as staff, organizational representatives, partnership facilitators would be those that would be an internal collaborative connection. And external collaborative connections, those would include ones that are involved in a collaborative effort, but they have no formal role in the partnership. So such as community-based organizations, funders, academic institutions, etc. In the management literature, the way that we define trust is that there are three key elements. There's integrity, benevolence, and ability. Integrity includes being honest, transparent, and consistent. Benevolence includes working towards a collective good. And ability also has to do with having knowledge and skills that they are able to accomplish the work. So you can have people who you know are honest and transparent, that you know they're working towards the greater good, but if you don't have and trust that they can actually get the work done, you're not going to be able to trust them. Just a note about trust. Trust, it takes time to establish, and it can also be lost very quickly. So I think that's one thing that's important to remember. So based on my research over the past 7 years, looking at multi-stakeholder partnerships, there are a couple of recommendations that I have generated that I've observed through doing this research. The first one is approaching connectivity and trust with an assessment mind. Thinking about how can we assess connectivity, how can we assess trust, it can really help with assessing the health of a partnership, and also it provides an opportunity to collect data to illustrate impact. So, so approaching this through that evaluative mindset, I think is very important. The next one is leveraging existing opportunities and creating new opportunities for connecting. Existing opportunities might be a pre-established monthly meeting, an annual community workday, a conference that may be a national conference on stewardship and conservation. New opportunities would be ones where you create, such as meeting for coffee or creating a 2-day workshop, such as, or several-hour workshop such as this one, or creating a science symposium hosted by a partnership, etc. And so, so you can leverage existing opportunities and you can create new ones. And then the third kind of recommendation that I would suggest is using these opportunities to illustrate trust. So using these opportunities to communicate honestly and openly, that's the integrity piece, about shared visions and goals, that's the benevolence piece, and then describe evidence of impact, showing that you are able to do that. So approaching these opportunities through that lens. When you're approaching these opportunities, there are a couple of considerations and questions that I would suggest that you think about. And Dylan already talked about, creating the conditions, and that's what we're talking about here. Chandi also noted the importance of having activities that are planned and connections that are more planned and ones that are more spontaneous. So thinking about through this lens, the first thing that you want to think about with an opportunity is the nature of the collaborative connections. Who will be there, or who do you want to be there? Ways to connect around the collaborative work. How can we use this opportunity to increase awareness, invite collaboration, share information, accomplish work? And then the third that you would want to think about in terms of when you're trying to create these moments for collaborative connections is, how can you connect with people on a personal level? In other words, how can we use this opportunity for socializing, getting to know each other, sharing information about your personal life, laughing and having fun? I'm just going to give a couple of just real specific examples that have emerged from based on my observations of different partnerships, and just ways that you can think about how you can either leverage existing opportunities or create new opportunities. So one example would be if you want to establish an internal, in that startup phase, establish an internal connection and leverage an opportunity, might be to invite a new partner member to a field trip organized by your agency. And you can, on that field trip, you can show a concrete example of impact. So what was the outcome of a project? And then you can integrate that social component to create some of maybe the more spontaneity, is watching a sunset over hors d'oeuvres. Or perhaps you could, in terms of strengthening an already established connection and focused on internal, focusing on internal connections by creating a new opportunity, would be, for example, organizing an event for the partnership staff to showcase one of their programs so that they can show what they're doing, invite other people to attend, and follow with a celebration by presenting, and then present a token of gratitude to those that worked on that particular program, and have a special cake as and we can see those images right in the middle there. For example, Untam, they did an excellent job in ways of celebrating and acknowledging others, that they always would give acknowledgement to those that were involved, and they found many opportunities to celebrate. Two other examples would be if you're trying to establish an external connection, and maybe you can leverage an opportunity such as, let's say, you're presenting your work, your partnership work at a national conference. One thing you could do is host a happy hour at the end of the day, and then invite others attending the conference and your session to that happy hour. Another example would be something along the lines of, let's say you're trying to strengthen an external connection and you're trying to create a new opportunity, would be to invite a funder to a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. You can share your successes and challenges with them, such as, showing, hey, that we earned, so for example, in that image in the middle, Untam earned an award, the DeWitt Award, and so you can show that funder, hey, we've made, we have some impact, and then you can ask for their input and express their appreciation and support. So I just wanted to highlight, here are a couple of ways that I've seen organizations and partnerships either leverage opportunities or create new opportunities to foster those collaborative connections and build trust. Sort of my parting thought is that I just want to remind folks that this assessment is an important piece, and there are ways that you can assess trust and impact, assess trust and connectivity and show that they are impactful. And there are some resources available at untam.org /PIM that can help you think through some ways that you can assess these squishier, if you will, concepts. I want to just thank you for your time. I know that this is a long workshop session, and so I just wanted to say thank you, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it on over to Devin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amy.
You're welcome.
Okay, anything else?
Yeah, so thanks. Just trying to get out of that screen share there for a minute, but thanks so much for tying that together, Amy. And I'm going to hand it off here to Dylan to provide some parting thoughts for the workshop. And once again, thank everyone for coming here. And as Dylan does that, I'm going to drop in just a link for you to reflect further upon the workshop right here in the chat box. So go ahead, Dylan.
All right, thanks, Devin. And thanks, Amy, for presenting that. If you all have a chance to read Amy's work on this partnership impact model, it's super interesting to go a little bit more deeply into it. So I really recommend that. I also want to just acknowledge that we're a few minutes over time. So we're ending now, don't worry. And we were going to do a little bit longer of a moment to reflect on what you've heard today, but we've all just gotten so excited that we just keep talking. So we're over time. So we're actually going to skip that part. But if you do want to give us any reflections, either in the chat box or if you want to email us later, we'd love to hear that. But thanks for being here today. Today we presented a kind of funnel of collaboration in which we started kind of at the top and wide with the whole world, and then got a little bit narrower to talk about networks, and then narrower still to talk about some personal behaviors and so on, the building of trust and all that kind of thing. And you know, there's a lot more that can be said about collaborative leadership. Hopefully one of the things that you got out of today, whatever else you got, is that your disposition is a hugely important factor in the success of collaborative projects. And of course, your disposition is informed by how you presume the world works. You know, if you understand systems and so on, you're more likely to understand the degree to which your actions have impact. If you understand complexity, you're more likely to be able to have tolerance for ambiguity. And all of that makes you, you know, more effective participant in these kind of networks and collaborative projects generally. So I do want to say that the purpose of today's workshop is not so much to give you, you know, the quiver full of skills and so on that you might run out and apply. But as I started out with saying that this was more about building awareness and introducing a kind of foundational understanding that will support your collaborative endeavors and hopefully act as a foundation that you can put other skills on top of. And, you know, as we all move forward in our development as collaborative leaders. So I want to thank you all for being a part of this. It was really enjoyable to present, and thanks to everyone else who presented. Devin and Yakuta and Chandni and Amy and Sean. And thanks to the California Landscape Stewardship Network for presenting this. It's been a good time, and I think that there's just one little last bit of business that Devin is going to tell us about the events that are coming up next that you can participate in. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Dylan, and thanks everyone once more. Here you are seeing it. Please do keep connected with us and head over to the network's website to see more about the 2020 summer series. And go ahead and email any of those folks below, including myself, to talk more about what we're building this summer. And we hope to see you again next week and throughout this month and throughout the season. So thanks so much for making the time this afternoon. It's been great seeing everyone, and please stay in touch.